different time zones to really kickstart a series of conversations around data colonialism, a term that was introduced to me by my colleagues Suruchi and Sagnik. Thank you so much for educating me on this. And while I was mulling over your concept note and what it means to me, and I have some remarks and I'm looking forward to really learning much more. But before that, let me also thank our partner institute at Cambridge on future intelligence. And I am absolutely sanguine about the fact that we shouldn't stop at one webinar and actually continue this as a series to be able to produce some substantive work and research collaborations going ahead. So, to open the discussion, many of you have joined this conference via Zoom and have given your entire personal details and information to Google. So the fact that that we have to discuss or have a conversation around data colonialism via what you understand by data colonialism is something that is curious to me. How do we then connect the rest of the world? How do you then define or achieve globalization? Because this seems to be the way of doing it, and unless there is another method of doing it. Last evening, I was asking Sagnik that what kind of data are we talking about here? Because I think that is what I try to understand, because there is one kind of data which is a government data and which is open source. And we want that to be open source. We want the quality of data to be better, but we don't want that data to not be open source. How that data is being collected is something probably you are concerned about. The second is that the data from apps, and which requires each person using that data to give their consent. So which means those companies are seeking your consent before actually taking your data, which means there is nothing technically wrong in that, unethical in that. The third kind of data, again, in which we are complicit in using tech to give our data, as we are discussing today. The third form is that research data. You are collecting, whether for social science, pharmaceutical comes top, of course, in that, collecting data for research, sometimes with consent, sometimes without consent, and where does that data go? How does that data get plowed really? But all this, I am guessing, is going to hinge around loose privacy laws, because that is the big problem of. But I'm not able to understand what is the threat that you perceive from big tech versus your domestic tech. So the digital public infrastructure, for which the government kind of wants itself and says, which is one of the biggest achievements of India over the last, let's say, the two terms of the Prime Minister, and the others constantly talk about that this is the biggest achievement, and no other country has been able to come close to what the digital public infrastructure that we've created. Maybe true, but it also, we know that in Aadhaar there have been leaks, 800 million leaks. The government can contest that, depending on who has done that survey, how we achieved that figure. But I can vouch for the fact the way my Aadhaar details were collected near my house in Calcutta, there is no way that the data is what was protected, or even the manner of connection was so shabby, was so shoddy that one can imagine. Now, what happened with that data? I am not saying, but yes, there is a problem of collecting personal data. But what is the threat again? I am not. Am I under threat because my data is now in the public?
No, it's not you. It's
Static.
no, yeah, it's the static. I've gotten in touch with Amy.
Okay. Sorry for people who are listening to it. I guess I hope you heard what I'm talking about. I'm kind of reiterating the fact that where is the practice?
Oh, my mic has to
Is
be on.
anyone else's thing on?
Um, Anybody else's microphone unmuted? I think.
So
Uh, okay, can you try now?
okay, I was talking about Facebook, which gives you a personal tag, and the content then is directed at the tag, not the person. So you actually get a tag. Uh, but why is the global north big tech bigger threat than domestic apps? And I would also want to hear people talk referring to the entire coverage or information that we received around Gaza violence in recent times without the big tech platforms, we wouldn't have known what was happening in Gaza. So again, it wasn't a threat in that case, but I'm sure these are things that are going to come up. So the difference between the domestic and the not threats. Inside the global south, also there's a power structure. So India had, and it happens to all the other, so there is a hegemonic kind of a relationship. Snoop, your neighbors, even whether you're small or big, you're constantly snooping. I mean, that part of your foreign policy is how good you can snoop and not get caught. So, and that part structure is bound to permeate into tech and data. I mean, it's impossible that data is going to be a very sanitized structure, whereas you have a caste hierarchy, you have a power hierarchy, etc. in the rest of the society because you're collecting data from the people. And slowly, AI will also recognize the idea of combination. So AI will only recognize the language and create its own language. So it's not an original language. So the language is going to be our combination, and it is again going to be so within the global south also we're going to have this conversation. But I'm sure by the end of tomorrow we will at least get some idea of what do you propose we stop doing. What is the first step in that direction against this colonialism if I was to agree that it's colonialism. But I will be skeptical and say that that I would that there is a colonialism even within where we are. I mean, even within Delhi and Sonipat. I mean, the data that you would have from Sonipat is far scarce. Not, what checked, fact checked. I mean, it's terrible data that we have last week, which is 40 kilometers from your capital, Delhi. And last bit that I want to alert and caution researchers, having been a journalist and knowing what has happened to journalism over the last few decades, is I hope when we are discussing and conversing and writing and researching on these matters, we are conscious of the semantics. in journalism, we did not realize how we surrendered to the language of power. Our editorials started sounding like press releases. We were repeating what generals and regimes and governments were saying. So, for example, to give you, two quick examples, the peace process is not a public word. Peace process is an American government. It's the State Department's word between Israel and Palestine, which means, and the peace process means the process will never end. It's a never-ending process. So so there is no end to it, and that is how all the peace processes across the world, from now continues with no end in sight, and we keep just talking about the world. We talk about a spike in violence. Again, it's an American military word. You either have a spike in your drink or a spike in violence. This is not the language of journalists. And I hope that when you are discussing data, we don't also start repeating the words that the big tech wants you to use. Because by doing that, you run the risk of actually surrendering and submitting to what we are trying to avoid and flag. And so all the best for the 2-day deliberations. I'd like to know, where are we exactly drawing the line between North and South, big tech, small tech, and keep in mind that the larger number of Indians are using now domestic apps. Your digital public infrastructure is not a global north. Data, which is being collected, cloud, and where exactly are we drawing the line? So, thank you so much. Thank you all of you for joining, and thanks to Suruchi and Sagnik again for organizing this.
All right, should we get on to the next panel? Yeah. Okay, so we will soon be starting the first panel, which is AI and geopolitics. I'm the chair, and we have with us Suruchi, Sagnik, Kerry, and Matt and Nikhil will soon be joining us. It's a pleasure to have you all. You can't see me, I'm afraid. That's because the camera is pointed towards the room. I know this seems rather peculiar since we're talking about data colonialism, and I'm feeling rather powerful here, like Big Brother, who is watching all of you, but who is not being watched since I'm behind the camera. I feel bad about this, but this is the design of the conference room. I'm not a very good Big Brother, clearly. Nonetheless, to begin, AI and firstly, of course, I would like to start by thanking the Dean for his remarks. I think, these are important questions. The question of where do we draw the line between North and South, between big and small tech, between also how to develop data in such a way that it is a challenge to the powers that be, rather than the language of oppression, and how do we develop data through as resistance, and how do we use data for emancipation, our own emancipation. So we will begin, of course, with AI and geopolitics, and I will leave most of the talking to Suruchi and Sagnik and Kerry. It's a pleasure to meet you all, because I haven't met you, Kerry. So it's great to meet you. Sagnik Datta is an associate professor of JGLS. He specializes in political theory, anthropology, critical socio-legal studies, and feminist and critical IR. Suruchi Mazumdar is also an associate professor of JSJC, and she's my colleague. I will leave it mostly to her to talk about her research interests and to connect it to the conference, since the conference is the joint brainchild of Kerry, Sagnik, and Suruchi. Kerry is a research associate at our partner institute. she's a senior research fellow, sorry, at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence, where she researches AI from the perspective of gender studies, critical race theory, and Asian diaspora studies. Matt, once he comes in, we still don't have him, is a researcher and an advisor on AI and human rights at Amnesty, and he's also an affiliated lecturer at the Department of Sociology. Nikhil of Media Nama, Nikhil Pava, he has created a body of work around privacy, free speech, and digital rights at Media Nama. And he is also a founder of Pen in Delhi. I will now hand over the mic to Shagnik. Oh, I see. Matt has come in as Shagnik. That's what has happened. Okay, so one of the Shagniks is Matt, just to let you all know. Do not send messages to one another. Apparently, there are 4 people with the name of Shagnik. Okay, will the real Shagnik Datta please stand up and take it from here? Press that button. Oh, Kerry should come in now. Sorry, not the real Shagnik Datta. Then Kerry,
I was one of the fake
come in
ones.
now and start the discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm not sure I can share my screen, but I didn't actually have that
Can't
much to
hear
share
you.
anyway. I just had a big, can you hear me? Can you hear me in the room?
Yes.
Yay. Okay, perfect. Okay, and Sophia says we can hear you. Perfect. Thanks. Just wanted to double check. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. And it's really exciting to see this conference finally come together. Shagnik and Suruchi and I wanted to open up this panel, I guess, just by providing a little bit of the context for this conference and what we were hoping to achieve with the workshop together. And so it's really lovely to finally all be brought together. And so I just want to begin by talking about the genesis of this conference and the kind of core thematics. This conference came out of a proposal for a special issue with Big Data and Society put together by Suruchi, Shagnik, and myself on the theme of data colonialism, and specifically thinking about everyday and lived experiences of data and colonialism in and from the global South. And so a major motivation for this special issue proposal is that we were really motivated by the wealth of very exciting scholarship that was coming out on digital colonialism, on data colonialism, all largely focused on the way that tech firms in the global North were increasingly extracting from the global South, reproducing kinds of coloniality and enforcing certain kinds of not just resource extraction, but also ideological regimes in these places. And this was an incredibly important line of inquiry. But at the same time, something that we felt like was maybe missing from this literature at that point, and there's now been really important contributions further here, of course, through things such as the recent Big Data and Society issue on AI in Latin America. But we felt at that time there was maybe not quite enough scholarship that was focusing explicitly on how data colonialism was being lived, but also how this language of data colonialism and associated political rhetorics of things like data nationalism, data sovereignty, were being deployed politically in the global South. So some of the questions that were driving this special issue proposal, and then we were hoping to discuss over these next 2 days, are things like how, for example, are the languages of data coloniality taken up by regimes across the global South? How are they appropriated and repurposed to different political agendas? How do they intersect with political movements around race, class, caste, gender, sexuality, among many other things? And what does everyday resistance to data colonialism look like? And so by asking these questions, something we really wanted to do was push this conversation beyond a one-directional form of extractivism and instead look at the broader political life of these questions and these discourses and these relations of power. And I think that's something that all the contributors to both the special issue, but also across these 2 days of the conference, are doing in really fascinating ways. And so before I hand over to Shagnik and Suruchi to talk a little bit more about some of the specific research we're doing on this topic, I guess I also just want to frame like what brought all the 3 of us to this topic. We're situated very differently. I'm based at the University of Cambridge. So I'm at an institution which is very much based in the global North and historically has been this colonial site of power. I originally come from Aotearoa, New Zealand. a white settler colony with its own very complex colonial history. But my family is largely from Fiji. And so these questions around geopolitics, around coloniality, and how that gets manifested through the question of data and digital development is also very present often when I'm thinking about what it means for us to digitalize and what it means for us to grapple with the emergence of these new technologies on an increasingly fraught geopolitical stage. So yeah, I'm very excited to be able to have this conversation with you all, and I'm now going to hand over, I believe, to Shagnik.
Shagnik, you have to press that button. Can everybody hear Shagnik?
Hi, hello. I thank you, Kelly, for getting us started. And Kelly has already laid out the contours of this research project and how we came together to think about data colonialism. So in this round, my research interests, so quite a lot of interest in questions of coloniality and I, because of my location in the global south, particularly, I'm interested in these questions of colonialism and what forms it takes in everyday life. And in this particular project, we are interested to explore the everyday life of data colonialism. And as a researcher, I have and up until now, my work has been really interested in exploring the questions of the everyday life below and minority rights and gender. And why I was kind of drawn to this project and these questions was also because the digital sphere is not divorced from questions of power, and the digital sphere and the way in which it is linked to questions of citizenship is something that I have intrigued about, and also the connection between gender, sexuality, and particular ways in which these new forms of data colonialism work is something that has been a topic of interest. So, yeah, so this is just briefly about my research background and how I got intrigued by this project. And I'm going to talk more about the particularities of what we are doing. And I'm starting my research interests.
So you have to press that button.
Yes, thank you both, Terry and Shagnik, for introducing the panel and also positioning your work. And yeah, it's kind of so to be kind of convener for this workshop and also to kind of conceive the special issue together. So I'll also briefly kind of speak about I think and how it relates to some of these themes of data colonialism that we are addressing and revisiting through the issue as well as the workshop. So I actually have a media and communication scholar, and that's my core disciplinary background.
Rinchi, you can't be heard. Can you? You'll have to press the button. Will that help?
Yes,
It's pressed. Do you want to come here?
should I unmute first?
I think you can come here.
Yeah, this is
Yeah. That help?
I think either she needs to use a wired mic or bring the laptop closer to itself.
I didn't hear you, Nikhil. Could you say that again?
Either use a wired mic or bring the laptop closer because the room is echoing.
Yeah, there's a wired mic. She's got a wired mic. It's got an inbuilt system, but I'll ask her to move here because here she'll be closer to the mic. Come this way.
So I'm actually a media and communication scholar. That's my core disciplinary background. And I have worked on media politics and social movements, digital activism. The way I got, interested in, this work and also in the ideas of, digital and data colonialism is because of my interest actually in global technology platforms and also information and data flow, from across South and Southeast Asia. I've also written about, Chinese global technology platforms and their, social implications in societies in South and Southeast Asia. And so this theme, allows me to connect some of my older work with, with the new data practices that are actually emerging and how, that allows us to actually revisit some of these questions of, new forms of colonialism. And so I think Kerry has already kind of introduced the term, like, some of the dominant ideas of the word data colonialism. And, also, in the introduction to the session, some of the key questions have also been raised, by the chair, by, the Dean, Kishaloy Bhattacharjee. And so some of the questions are actually kind of, we deal when we begin the term data colonialism. The general focus has been on the unequal relationship between, the companies, the tech corporations that are there in the global north. And when it comes to specifically the term data colonialism, it focuses on how they kind of draw on the extractivist policies, or how actually they kind of take the data, social behavioral data from, the global population with whom they kind of have a more unequal relationship. So we are actually revisiting the concept, and we are, more interested in, positioning a more complex role of the state in the global south. So Shagnik in a bit will, introduce what we mean by global south. But for now, what I'm going to do is that I will actually speak a little bit about the different facets of the more complex role of the state that has actually emerged in the present day. So some of the, idea is actually when it comes to the state, and its relationship with the digital platforms, we refer to specific, nation states. Of course, the, Chinese example actually comes to our mind. And we think about these very domestically developed and owned digital platforms, right, which are largely, meant to be used by the citizens, and it's also kind of controlled by the state. So China obviously is a, prominent example there. And also when we are talking about recentering the role of the state, we have to kind of speak about their relationship with the private actors. So, even when we speak about China, the private actors, like if we speak about, say, ByteDance or, Baidu, Tencent, these are companies which are private companies, but, we know that the CEOs or like the owners, they have a very close relationship with the state. And also, like, in the Indian case also, it's kind of coming to similar. We immediately to, all of us who are here, the term of the Reliance, the example of Reliance, and, that example comes to our mind, where this is a private company, but it kind of shares a very close, a relationship with the Indian state or the Indian government, I would say. So if I actually say, how are we to kind of describe these, these domestic digital platforms that have actually emerged now? What is the term that we can develop? So I refer to, Sabina Milej, who's also a media communication scholar, and she has written about, the different forms of platforms and the new forms of nationalism here. So she refers to the term digital. These companies can be actually called digital national champions. And what is it that they're actually doing? They're creating certain national digital infrastructures, these tech companies, and they, emerge as, regional or global players. And in some cases, they actually, have dominate the certain regional market. In some cases, in certain examples, their certain policy aligning with the state is to actually challenge the hegemony of the US, based, global tech platforms. So for instance, Russia's Yandex is one. India, of course, is a growing actor there. If we kind of think about this entire digital ecosystem that has emerged right now, I mean, if we think about the entire, different apps and platforms that have come up, especially in the post TikTok, ecosystem that has emerged, like, after the ban of TikTok, there is a new range of indigenous apps that have actually come up, Mojo and ShareChat and so many others. Mojo obviously is like, one example. Plus there are many, the example of who is kind of comes to our mind. And also there are other platforms when we are talking about these, many of these, platforms emerging as a regional actor. They're of course like, Reliance and so on, we cannot call them as a more, regional actor. They're largely focusing on the national, within the domestic audience now. But I can refer to other examples. Of course, WeChat is much of a global player. We know the, TikTok, ByteDance, so, ByteDance owned app, which is more of a global platform. But there are other, regional actors that have also come up, like, iFood from Brazil, which is a kind of regional actor in Latin American countries. Grab, which is actually a Singapore-owned multinational company, which is, has a, strong domestic market in Southeast Asian region. So these are some of the examples, but even though many of these are actually private players, in with certain variations, they kind of enjoy, there is a kind of, proximity with the state. And of course, when we speak about the national, digital infrastructure that has come up, especially again, if I say that again, the global tech companies, transnational companies also play a very important role in creating the digital infrastructure. For instance, in India, Facebook, Google, these are some of the platforms who have actually contributed to the making of this digital infrastructure, here. And also when we talk about we speak about, data, the other thing that actually comes important, and I'm sure we are going to be discussing it in, in other different panels and our sessions, we speak about the regulation of data, where, these different, different nation states, they have actually tried to propose regulation. Again, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation is kind of one of the pioneers in the area. And, many other countries, like starting from Argentina, Brazil, South Korea, they have, and in, especially Russia, Turkey, and India, they have actually proposed, data localization requirement, that the data should within, there should be certain, regulation that would ensure that data remains within the, national geographical territory. And of course, security is one of the rationale that comes in here. So, this is where, we have to we are trying to recenter, reposition the role of the state. And when we think about sovereignty, we see that, this is like the form of national, the form of nationalism, or the form of is actually one form of sovereignty that is actually kind of imagined by the different, the different states in across, across the global South. And so we kind of endeavor to kind of think about how the state, what are the different inequalities of power that are actually emerging because of this complex role of the state and their equation with the private actors. And, it, extends to actually compromises with the, human rights. They kind of recreate certain kind of settler colonialism structures with the, local population here. So perhaps Shagnik can speak a little more about that. So I'll stop here.
Hello, am I audible? Anyone hear me well?
Should I check?
I actually, my
Open chat.
Is Shagnik audible? Can you hear him?
Chat. It's the question also on the chat.
Can you say that my side, maybe I need
Yes.
to move.
You'll have to move here. Yes.
Amazing.
They love me.
Sorry.
The sound is great from where Suruchi and Ruchira are sitting. Yes, Kerry. That's because we are
I
on
don't think the
the
mics are
computer mic.
working very well.
Yeah.
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I think Shuruchi has covered most of the ground. So what I'll briefly comment on is this whole idea of the Global South and where we are trying to go with our project. So the Global South historically has been conceptualized as large parts of the world that were under colonial rule and who are now still dealing with the genealogies of colonialism, so to speak. So yeah.
It's all right.
Yeah. So, the large parts of the globalized world that are dealing with, I don't know how to do this. Sorry.
Hang on.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Hang on. Hang on. Is everybody on mute? Everybody's on mute? Yes, everybody is on mute. No, Shagnik is not on. What we have to do is we have to mute Shagnik from here.
Huh.
You are not on. From here, I leave them. Oh, now
Hello.
that
Yeah, so sorry about the disruption. So what I was saying is that we think about the global south as this conceptual category that is that refers to large parts of the world that were colonized and that were under colonial rule, and also currently that these are parts of the world that are trying to make sense of the genealogies of colonialism. So having said that, in our project we are trying to push back a little bit against this idea of the global south as some sort of a homogeneous category, and in all of the examples that Shruti gave, what very clearly comes out is how there are a lot of power hierarchies, there are a lot of hierarchies and structural inequalities within the global south itself, which is why we need to unpack the category of the global south and also think about new ways in which colonialism is reconstituted in the global south by the post-colonial elite. So, for instance, in the Indian state, if you look at the ways in which data is used by the Indian state to stop activism and to hound out activists who are protesting the state. That is one very good example which shows us how colonial kind of ideologies of rule are being appropriated by the post-colonial elite. So again, data comes into play in a very major way in these instances of, say, the use of facial recognition technology. This is a disaster.
no, you don't worry about it. Just ask, are you audible?
Niharika is saying
Niharika
that.
is saying not audible. Okay. Move this closer to you. Yeah.
Yeah, am I audible now? Okay, great. Yeah, so sorry, I do apologize. So what I was saying is that this category of the Global South itself is not a flattened category, and the examples that Shuruchi gave, they bring out very well what are the ways in which the post-colonial elite is using colonial ideologies of rule, especially when we are thinking about the use of technologies of surveillance in an Indian context, such as facial recognition technology and so on. There is the kind of widespread appropriation of data to serve the ends, the interests of the post-colonial elite, and also to clamp down on activists and so on. And we have to remember that these new technologies are again crafted onto an existing statecraft of colonialism and colonial rule. And therefore, we do need to think about data colonialism in these particular contexts in the global south that takes into consideration these new modalities of colonialism, as it were, and colonial ideologies, as it were. So that's kind of, and also to kind of briefly draw upon this idea of reconceptualizing the state itself and the multiple ways in which sovereignty can be reconstituted. It's the focus of a lot of the contributions in this workshop and of our paper as well, because sovereignty itself is not just confined to national sovereignty defined from a very statist perspective, but sovereignty, if we think about sovereignty as a larger concern that has to do with ownership of your data and so on, of community-based ideas of sovereignty over your data. So those are the kinds of concepts that we try to unpack when we think about, these moments where communities are laying claim, activists, digital rights activists, and communities are talking about how their data can be used in particular ways and are resisting this kind of very state-defined concept of sovereignty. And secondly, kind of just to draw upon the earlier remark that was made by Kishalaya as well, this whole question of the relationship with uh, private corporations is also something that's a little more complicated in a context like India, because what emerges from a lot of conversations that we've had thus far with activists and so on is that the threat to civil liberties and so on in an Indian context is kind of largely from an authoritarian state. And in these moments of conflict, for instance, when Twitter is being asked to take down posts, or when there are instances of other platforms that are being asked to take down any posts that are critical of the Indian government, it is the Indian state that is clamping down on private corporations. And it's not a straightforward story of the expropriation of data by multinational corporations, because the authoritarian state here is a much more powerful entity, which is inimical to the interests of activists and which is having an impact, as it were, on the way in which people can own data. And also there are, on the other hand, these kind of uh, alliances between the Indian state and some of these smaller startup companies that are, supplying facial recognition technology and these other kinds of surveillance systems. So it's a far more messy terrain, so to speak, when with regard to the relationship between the state and these private corporations and the big tech on the other hand, and we kind of would like to focus on the messiness of these relationships. I'm sure they'll come out in the days to come to kind of further analyze how we might think about data colonialism and who the different actors are in this project of data colonialism, who we might want to think about and what kind of power they yield on data and so on. So I think I'm going to stop here, and thank you so much to all of you for joining us today, and we really look forward to the conversations through the day. Thank you, and sorry for the bad audio.
I apologize that we are all playing musical chairs at this point. Okay, so we can take a few questions. Kerry, do you want to come in? Oh, we have Matt right now. Yes, yeah, we don't.
And then
Yeah, Matt is here.
After Matt and Nikhil,
Then we can open up for questions. Okay, Matt, could you come in?
Yes, so it doesn't look like I can turn on my video, but I don't want to add.
Let me try to, I will add a pin and then I will try to figure out.
No, now we can. Now we can.
I'll fix this. Give me a second, huh? Can you get Matt to turn on his mic? Yeah, I
Okay.
got you.
Great,
Fantastic.
perfect. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me, and thank you so much for those incisive interventions from previous panelists as well. I doubt I'm going to be adding anything new, but I'm couching a lot of my analysis in both what we've been observing in the context of Gaza and its involvement with AI companies and the Israeli impartment of unfolding genocide, as well as couching that in what we've seen as 75 years of apartheid, whilst also trying to draw linkages between broader movements towards constricting movements and profiting off of human movement. I will say that I'm straddling two different hats, as some of you will be aware, as both a researcher and advisor at Amnesty Tech, whilst also being an academic and affiliated lecturer at the Department of Sociology. So some of this will reflect both research that I've done in my NGO context, whilst also trying to remain as unfiltered as possible in my capacity as an academic. Apologies for the hat shifting that you might notice in some of this. So on November 17th, 2023, reports of Palestinians being held en masse in between two large structures on Salah al-Din Road in Gaza started to surface. Over a month after the Israeli occupation forces' bloody siege on Gaza, it had allegedly opened a corridor to the south, albeit governed by reported facial recognition technologies. No airstrike, which to date has contributed to over 34,000 civilian deaths, seemed imminent enough to foreclose the mass biometric conscription of one of the world's most heavily surveilled communities. Palestinians were narrowly escaping death only to face the surveillance gaze of a regime which, even in its purported evacuation efforts after destroying the last vestiges of the homes and neighborhoods of a community of refugees, insisted on extracting their likeness or biometric data in exchange for safety. Elsewhere, at checkpoints in the West Bank, a new facial recognition program called Red Wolf scans Palestinian faces and adds them to vast databases, which are used to intensify surveillance and the draconian closure regime that the state of Israel imposes on Palestinians in places like Hebron. These systems is described as an innovation of the Blue Wolf system that some of you might have heard of and originally reported by Elizabeth Dworkin of the Washington Post, which was a mobile application that Israeli soldiers have previously referred to as the Facebook for Palestinians and the Palestinian Surveillance Registry, otherwise known as Wolfpack. With the Red Wolf system, Israeli authorities have taken the worst possible dystopian fantasies, the idea of an automated system that controls and dominates Palestinians, and made a reality of it. So now residents in places like Tel Romeda and H2 area of Hebron have to contend with facial recognition systems, recognizing them in order to pass checkpoint 56, a prerequisite for accessing everything ranging from medical services and education to work and access to grocery amenities. So Red Wolf is just the latest in a slew of AI-driven surveillance technologies that have been experimented with on Palestinians under the auspices of so-called smart city initiatives. Obfuscate is what is at its core an automation of apartheid. Between anomaly detection systems, gait recognition, predictive analytics, and facial recognition, Israel's oppression of Palestinians is undergirded by a rampant techno-security industry with a presence and impact far beyond the region. And I think this is how we start to also conceptualize of the presence of data colonialism in this context. And so the infrastructures of violence tried and tested in this particular context and their logics constitute the modus operandi of how much of the smart or safe city interventions operate today under a veneer of greater convenience and safety, but to profoundly devastating effect. Since Israel originally imposed a near complete siege on Gaza in October 2023, it has reportedly been using artificial intelligence tools to further streamline its campaign of relentless killing, destruction, violence, and unfolding genocide in Gaza. Between the Hapsora system, the Gospel, and the Lavender systems, which purport to remotely, biometrically, and automatically identify military targets and calculate the number of civilian casualties that can be expected with a strike, facial recognition deployed to identify Israeli hostages and Hamas operatives, and novel forms of social media surveillance and complete telecommunications control, Gaza has effectively gone from being the world's largest open-air prison to an open-air exposition for technologies of violence. Now, tech giants such as Amazon and Google are very much a part of the core of the supply chain of technologies adapted for repressive purposes, the brand names normalizing the trade. Both companies are engaged in developing a military and policing cloud service project, especially for Israel, called Project Nimbus, valued at $1.2 billion. In January 2024, Palantir also announced that its artificial intelligence platform for defense which uses large language models and AI for defense and military organizations. And this comes sort of on the back of the company announcing in November 2023 that it had been supplying these new products to Israel since following the October 7th Hamas attack and Israel's near total blockade over Gaza. Now, these developments are symptomatic of a larger pattern of investments in the hundreds of millions and billions of dollars in the militarization and datafication of societies, both within and without Western liberal democracies, in a move that can best be described as automating and normalizing xenophobia. Border enforcement regimes across the globe have also sought out Israeli high-tech products emboldened by their successful use in the occupied Palestinian territories. The mass surveillance regimes in the occupied Palestinian territories have in many ways become the gold standard, even in liberal democracies in the United States and the European Union. On the US southern border, for example, US Customs and Border Protection is using dozens of surveillance towers set up by the Israeli company Elbit Systems to improve border security and force protection with the help of, quote unquote, artificial intelligence and automation. The Israeli company Usto, which is the controversial AI-driven surveillance manufacturer formerly known as AnyVision, is now offering law enforcement agencies cost-effective facial recognition technologies with real-time watch listing capabilities. Since Microsoft sold its 40% stake in Usto predecessor, following revelations that its technology was being used at checkpoints in the occupied West Bank, the company has shifted its focus to the United States, where it has increased its presence. And so the original repugnancy around its uses in the West Bank didn't actually do anything beyond allowing it to take a different form and still penetrate a market in this particular way. Now, this, I argue, is a contemporary technological manifestation of racial capitalism. It's an economic system first coined, of course, by Cedric Robinson, which is fundamentally concerned with exploiting racialized populations for power and for profit. And this is carried out, I argue, in two ways. First, certain racial, ethnic, national, and religious groups are identified through social construction as a threat to the public, creating the rationale for investment in sophisticated technologies to keep them at bay. And second, that a techno-security industrial complex keeps fears of the threat alive through product marketing plans, creating a supportive environment for divisive and xenophobic politics. So technology companies provide government entities with data derived from their products to give credence to certain political claims, and that justify associated governance decisions, and government bodies provide the products of these technology companies with legitimacy in turn. So they keep each other going. Packaged as products to enhance security in largely urban contexts increasingly, the technologies that we've discussed previously are drawn from both the military, the border, the prison, and the policing industrial complexes. They often include biometric and AI-driven technologies such as facial recognition, anomaly detection, autonomous weapons, and crowd dispersal systems, as well as robotics. They also include the enabling infrastructure, including cloud computing and services, storage, data sets, and processing facilities. In short, often the sort of hidden costs, the tools that connect, power, and operationalize many of the technologies discussed in this intervention. The narrative is what makes technologies used against Palestinians in Gaza and Hebron and East Jerusalem transferable to places hosting other oppressed and marginalized communities in places like Hyderabad, London, and New York City, under the auspices of greater convenience and safety for citizens and communities. And governments around the globe effectively have invested in highly securitized smart cities that inevitably diffuse the same logics of control that you might observe in Palestine elsewhere. So across the world, these systems are increasingly adopted as almost inevitable in the growth and development of cities in particular. Regimes of control in carceral urban spaces range from automated welfare assessment, prison systems, refugee camp administration, border control, and management of so-called ghettos. In all cases, they follow many of the same racialized logics of control used in the occupied Palestinian territories. And as I've advanced in another paper, digital urban infrastructures deployed under a veneer of greater efficiency and safety often entangles historically racialized and marginalized communities with exploitative practices of technology production in what I conceptualize as the digital periphery. It is in their names, think of the many narratives that posit AI as a solution to the plight of the poor, the racially marginalized, the otherwise excluded, and often to their detriment. So think of the many instances in which these very tools are used to surveil, track down, detain, deport, and in other ways penalize these very communities, that these systems gain traction, notoriety, and profitability. So without the existence of this digital periphery, of this racialized periphery, these technologies often don't have a purpose and they need to be reified in different ways. So the drive towards smart cities has given governments the ability to erect a mirage of control through technology-based order and efficiency, while allowing the technology companies to become an essential part of the performance of governance and social control, oftentimes without being openly acknowledged as such. Now, smart city technologies have and continue to be weaponized towards practices rooted in dated, racially discriminatory pseudoscience, as we've seen time and time again. Take, for example, attempts at ascertaining the race, gender, and the perceived emotional state of an individual remotely. Not only do these tools impart significance on machine-legible biological difference rooted in race science, but assume universal emotional expressiveness too. These long-debunked problematic practices exacerbate existing policing processes by which minority communities are targeted, surveilled, and persecuted. Taking a few examples. Let's look at New York City, where the facial recognition tool, the domain awareness system, promises city dwellers less intrusive policing, but because this system is deployed in areas where individuals are at greater risk of being stopped and frisked, the subjects caught in the surveillance dragnet are disproportionately people of color. Or the experience of residents of Hangzhou, Sanmenxia, and Wenzhou, China, where the use of the SenseTime system is instructive. The company, which by 2022 had raised over $512 million, is being used to identify and profile Uyghur ethnic minorities using facial recognition, against whom China continues to commit crimes against humanity. We also know that the construction of smart cities may also result in displacement of vulnerable populations. For example, in order to commence building of the futuristic desert megacity of Neom, a $500 billion initiative incorporating artificial intelligence and advanced surveillance systems purportedly to automate city management, Saudi Arabia is evicting the Huwaitat tribe residing in the villages of Al Khurayba, Sharma, and Gaya. With expanding digital infrastructures in urban environments, private companies and their technologies become a central component of the state, further centralizing the city's power, including over when and where to construct and upgrade infrastructure, to surveil, to distribute resources, to displace communities, etc. This in turn exerts technology companies in the business of government, while digitally fusing characteristics that determine privilege and marginality, such as race, to communities and their urban futures. So by situating the automated apartheid in Palestine as an open-air technology exposition, I've attempted to weave together the development and deployment of the repressive technologies and its attendant global supply chain with the future of urban life in so-called smart cities around the world. To reflect on the digital configuration of racial marginalization in cities requires recalling the conditions of Palestinians whose restrictive lives emanate not only from Israel's apartheid regime over them, but also from the ever-evolving presence of digital control and domination. The management of Palestinians under apartheid directs a digitally reinforced Western Orientalism towards the Palestinian subject, stemming, in Edward Said's term, from an inaccuracy produced by too dogmatic a generality and too positivistic a localized focus. The differential construction of them as threatening others situates Palestinians effectively as inferior populations that must be managed, contained, neutralized, or studied, and closely surveilled. This rings true, of course, of many different racialized and marginalized communities around the world who are subject to similar control logics within their cities. Even in occupied East Jerusalem, often posited as a sort of a melting pot, Palestinians are digitally flagged, persecuted, detained, or denied by virtue of their relationality to acts of deviance and resistance. Again, we see how affiliations and manners of speech online, for example, would also flag individuals regardless of whether they are in Palestine or not. So we see these logics, again, disaggregate and disseminate in other contexts. As such, contemporary occupied Palestine exists very much as a prototype for the globally disaggregated reality of data colonialism. Anyway, I'll stop there, but looking very much forward to engaging with the rest of the panelists and the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. That was very, very interesting, very insightful. And, it taught me so much that I did not know about how facial recognition techniques are used and AI techniques are used to create a digital subject, which is then governed and managed, so as to speak. Nikhil, could you come in here? I will try to put a pin on. I will try to put a pin on you. And
I just wanted to make sure I'm audible.
Yes, you are audible, you are visible, you are
Great,
pinned,
thank you.
and yeah,
Okay.
we can.
Matt, thank you for that excellent intervention. I knew some of the details, but not at the granularity that you shared. Um, and I'm not going to repeat some of the points that you made, but I'll try and add to it. We are currently in a situation globally, and I'll talk to more geopolitics, in terms of global regulation as well. We're in a situation where there's a state of anarchy related to AI and AI regulation. And you might recall that on multiple occasions, Sam Altman of ChatGPT's sought to get AI regulated at the UN. Um, the fact remains that the best way to make sure there is no regulation is to ask for the UN to regulate it. Because by the time it gets any sort of a treaty or a norm or a regulation out, it's already too late. And we've seen the open-ended working group on cyber stalling for years now, um, and basically no outcome regarding the usage of cyber weapons globally. Um, and while all of this is happening, we're seeing the deployment of AI in warfare, as Matt had very clearly illustrated. I think the an F-16, an AI-operated F-16 recently took flight maybe a few days ago. There is no global treaty right now regarding the usage of autonomous weapons in warfare or by the military. And AI companies are signing up with militaries to empower them. Um, it's also important to remember that these autonomous weapons are not just killing machines. AI technologies, as Matt also pointed out, enhance information warfare and information gathering capabilities, and can be used as a means of of suppression, uh, both within the state, but also by extraterritorial entities, especially during elections. We're already seeing deep fakes. We're seeing, and eventually we will see. And the one that I really worry about is that we will eventually see
Sorry,
the.
sorry, there's an echo issue. Just let me figure out what I
Okay.
can do here.
I think some of the mic need to be switched off if there's a mic on in the room.
So mic on in the room, that's ours. Okay, I will switch.
Right. So why I'm highlighting autonomous aspects of deployment is because we are just seeing the initial stages of autonomous and semi-autonomous agents take shape. And right now, even from
You give me a second, there's an issue. I'm just trying to sort it out.
okay, usually this issue comes from mics being on. Uh, does this work, or is there still an issue?
Nicholas, the support is sending someone. Give me a second. This is something I can't.
Okay.
All right, then we can just go on. There's an issue here, but AV will send someone. I will mute my mic till then.
Just check if any of the other wired mics in the room are on. They could also be, relaying the audio back. That's probably where the problem is. Anyway, I'll carry on. So what I'm saying is that eventually we'll see autonomous creation of disinformation as well. And why I'm highlighting the autonomous aspects is because we're just seeing the deployment of autonomous and semi-autonomous agents. We've seen them over the last year, year and a half, and increasingly we're seeing them being deployed for petty tasks. And these agents are basically now online agents, AI agents are now beginning to become mainstream. And eventually their capability is going to improve and grow. Who's going to make the most of these these AI developments is where the geopolitics come in, because there's geopolitics of data, there's geopolitics of chip and rare earth materials. There are, of course, geopolitical issues related to governance, which I highlighted, and that's where the liability of issues that arise out of the deployment of AI comes in. And that's why I said that we are globally in a state of anarchy here. When you talk about data, there's a few things to consider, right? And I think one of the mistakes that most people make when talking about data from a resource perspective is that they tend to ignore the aspect that data is actually fungible. It's not just because it's being stored in a particular part of the world or it's being taken by a particular company, doesn't mean that that data can't be replicated. It doesn't mean that more data can't be collected by other sources. And so, when you talk about usage or harvesting of data from the global south, the fact is that data is also available to everyone and it can be repeatedly generated. So this whole concept that we saw being discussed in India around non-personal data and the creation of data trusts in the EU for sharing of non-personal data, um, uh, those uh, and in fact, one of India's old e-commerce policies back in, I think, 2019 also talked about taking data from big tech and giving it to third parties. Um, I think that line of thinking is basically contingent on the idea that once data is extracted or taken out by and used and given to, let's say, a big tech firm, uh, it can't users won't be generating any more data, or there won't be duplication of data available, and no one else can basically use it. So this idea of data as a national asset, which we hear often in India, is, to my mind, completely flawed. If anything, I like Bruce Snyder's approach of, from a security standpoint, looking at data as a toxic asset, where he says that the loss of data or the stealing of data is more harmful because it can be used against individuals, which is what we are seeing, because India works with the perspective of seeing data as oil. And it tries to, in that process, generate more and more data, which is why you're seeing Aadhaar and you're seeing deployment of this so-called digital public infrastructure, which I think is flawed in its definition, because if you look at the G20 definition of digital public infrastructure, by that logic, Google and WhatsApp are also digital public infrastructure. And let's not forget that every one of these entities, except for Aadhaar, whether you look at DigiYatra, you look at UPI, you look at ONDC, these are all run by privately owned companies and not by the Indian government. So what's public about them is not very clear, and whether they are in public interest or not is also not very clear. And even when it comes to monopolies in the market, they're failing to break those monopolies. They're only enabling creation of more monopolies, because you've had a duopoly of MasterCard and Visa and digital payments replaced by a monopoly of NPCI. No one asks NPCI, um, when it comes to digital payment, why certain companies have got approvals at certain points in time, why some have been rejected. Why was PhonePe, for example, the first UPI company to launch? In that sense, no one asks ONDC about why Paytm Mall was the first to do a rollout of ONDC. And so there is no transparency, there is no accountability, and these are certainly not public entities. But what they are doing is generating a vast amount of data. Nandan Nilekani, the former chairman of UIDAI, has said multiple times that India is a data-rich country. Unfortunately, it is the leak of this data that is also resulting in a large number of scams. But I'm digressing from the AI perspective, and one other aspect of AI that we need to consider. So I'll just close up on data localization. I wanted to clarify that has not enabled data localization except for for digital payments, and that too has come in from the Reserve Bank of India. In the law, India is whitelisted, has taken a blacklisting approach. That there are certain countries where data transfers will not be allowed, but globally it will work. And this is particularly useful for Indian startups and Indian companies that I engage with. And I run an online company as well, simply because we use multiple global services, and to be restricted via data localization norms is problematic, because services end up not working here. And we've seen that with some of the actions that the Reserve Bank of India has taken regarding tokenization, and also in terms of restricting recurring payments, where multiple global payments fail for customers all the time. And so we have to be very careful when we play around with the complex interconnecting relationships that the internet is. It is a network of global networks, right? And when you start playing around with that, with means of data localization or restricting data transfers, then many of these tools actually break, and that only ends up cementing the monopoly of larger players, um, because they have the ability to localize that data and decide to serve a particular market and ignore others. So localization, to my mind, is a fool's errand. But there is a counterpoint to this as well. So, for example, just a few weeks ago, the US has approved the RISA Act, which enables extraterritorial surveillance of people, including citizens in India, um, by the US government via big tech companies that operate across the world. China itself has its national intelligence law and cybersecurity law, which also enable this. So if that was the primary rationale for basically uh, banning TikTok, because it could be used for surveillance activities and there were data protection concerns. And we see some of these also play out in terms of the Schrems cases, and the data transfers between the EU and the US. I'm not sure if the US has a leg to stand on over here. And US big tech clearly has something to answer for, because what protections do citizens of this country have when it comes to our data being surveilled on by the US government? I'm just going to move on to chips, and one of the big global conversations is around compute and AI, and availability of chips, manufacturing of chips, the scarcity of rare earth materials. I think there are two ways to solve this problem. One is, of course, produce more chips, but the other is make the processing and the training and the algorithms a lot more efficient. And I think we'll see both things move at the same time. Already, we are seeing deployments of large language models on mobile devices locally. And so edge computing is here to stay, and it's only going to increase with time. Open sourcing of AI models also helps, and that addresses some of the geopolitical concerns regarding the concentration of power in case of AI. So eventually, your phones will be powerful enough to run very large models. Um, the and so while there are currently competition issues, right, because there are 5 or 6 large players, and there is a significant amount of lobbying happening in the US against open sourcing of AI and open source models. I think the spread of open source is what is really going to enable the addressing of competition issues. And the Digital Markets Act has done well to integrate virtual assistants in its ambit in terms of the core services where data sharing needs to be consent-based. But we're also going to see more competition action happening there in order to address the concentration of power with a few US companies. Um, the liability of AI is also a consideration, and we saw a big issue in India in Feb because an output was deemed to be defamatory towards our Prime Minister. And over there, I think a lack of understanding of AI was a problem because outputs are probabilistic in nature. They are based on source data, training weights, and no one can really predict what an output might be. What we're looking at generative AI is basically a next word prediction model based on normative distribution, where and you can play around with the probabilities using temperature settings and things like that. So, there is a flaw in terms of how how these models are currently being sought to be regulated in India. And we need more of a principles-based regulation. But the tricky part is going to be about liability and ownership, and how do you hold a model liable um, on the edge, for example, right, when it's deployed on a device. And when agents come in, this problem is going to be exacerbated because who's going to, and how does a jurisdiction basically assert its regulation over a model deployed on a device if, let's say, the model originated in a country that's not the country where this issue is popped up, right? So um, there are going to be issues around biased data, around and the statistical models that are used and the outputs that they're putting out, the training weights that are in use. Um, it can also mean the pushing of bias and values of one country's models into another country. And so the regulation of AI from all of these parameters, especially when it comes to establishing owner and liability, is going to be upon us sooner than we probably expect. One last point, I think we should remember that because there were some comments around big tech and their hegemony. Um, let's not forget that the state likes large platforms and fewer large platforms because they prefer to regulate through them. And if we see that there are platforms that are bending to the wills of states, look at the laws that govern those platforms, right? And I don't think any state wants to have, and we see this with the Reserve Bank of India and fintech, for example. No regulator likes to have multiples of thousands of entities to regulate. They'd rather do with 50. So I'll end here, but broadly, those are my comments on the geopolitical aspects of AI.
You, Nikhil, you've given us a lot to think about, especially when we talk about data as a decentralized or a centralized asset, and whether it is a toxic asset or whether it is in fact a national asset. You of course say it's a toxic asset. I found it all very interesting. Uh, Apologies to everybody for our technical inconveniences. We've still managed to get the panel done, and that has taken some doing. Nonetheless, shall we open for questions? You can all put in your questions in the chat box. There's also the Q&A. If you raise hands, I should be able to unmute you with a little bit of a lag. I should be able to unmute you, and you can step in and ask the questions here. To kickstart the discussion, I've been primarily thinking about two important aspects. One is, there's always this dream that data is in some way decentralized. And we talk about, in fact, domestic apps, global south apps, data being localized in the global south. giving the global south an avenue to grow and prosper through data. That there's one narrative there. On the other hand, we have the other narrative of how data is constantly being centralized. It is got very few players working in it. There are natural monopolies which we cannot break very easily. So, how do the panelists think about, in that sense, both the challenges that come from the very centralized infrastructure of data and the opportunities that, I mean, are there any opportunities from data decentralization? And can we have sovereignty in the true sense where we get to own our own data? I'll open to you all. Anyone who wants to begin? Shagni, do you want to come in here, talk about sovereignty? Yeah, I think so. I will, should I mute myself so that he can speak? Okay, I'll mute myself. Okay. Shakti.
Yeah, fine. So, thank you, Ujira, for those thoughts. And indeed, so what we were trying to think about with regard to sovereignty is that, you know,
Yeah.
Comes to centralization, what does centralization entail in an Indian context specifically, because there is the upsurge of the very authoritarian
Sorry,
state.
there's too much of an echo. I can't hear you, Sadhana.
You want to come in here?
Yeah,
Yeah, we'll play musical chairs again.
yeah. Am I audible now? Is this
Much
better?
better, thank you. Much better, thank you.
Sorry. So just to answer Ruchira's questions about centralization of data and what implications it has. So for a context like India, where we're seeing the upsurge of an authoritarian state and also these entanglements between some of these private corporations and the state, centralization has very, very obvious risks for the concept of citizenship itself. And therefore, we do need to think about it from the perspective of citizens, and especially from the perspective of citizens from marginalized communities. One needs to take into consideration questions of caste and gender, religion, and so on. And we also, I mean, I do want to point out a little bit that we have been talking about data with regard to these new technologies and so on, but it is also important to bear in mind how these new technologies are entangled with existing structures of governance, with structures of carcerality and so on. So we should probably not lose sight of that, because that helps us in understanding the particularities of power structures in a global south context. And secondly, to kind of come to the concept of sovereignty itself, and how do we recover the concept of sovereignty. And again, that's a question that we're going to explore through the course of this workshops. I don't have a very clear answer right now. So there are some concepts such as indigenous sovereignty and so on, for instance, which have been very useful concepts to think about with in other contexts. But in a context like India, like community ownership of data is also a concept that needs to be thought through in relation to the question of caste and other kind of hierarchies within communities. So we can't just talk about we can't invoke the category of the community unproblematically, so to speak, and just say that this is an alternative to the state because of the ways in which kind of historically the community has also been a site of oppression with regard to caste, but also with regard to gender, for instance. So those are the ways in which we can then think about, are we thinking about communities in terms of data communities? Is it kind of a particular group of people who are coming together in these moments, politically some sort of collective action is happening around data ownership? Is that like a new framework that we might want to think about? So those are some conceptual possibilities that maybe I'd like to flag at this stage. So, but thank you for your remarks, Ruchira. Others?
So I had a comment on a couple of points. One was that when I talked about data, I was uh, mostly I was not referring to decentralization. That's a different concept altogether. I was talking about fungibility of data. There is, when data is created, or when, especially when, so there are two types of data, right? One is personal data, and that's replicated by us across multiple places. The other is co-created or or derived data, which is on the basis of our interaction with services. So, for example, when someone clicks on an article on my news publication, I have data in terms of who's clicked on what. Now, that data doesn't belong to the user who's clicked it, and therefore that's why you'll see in the Data Protection Act in India, in the DPDP Act, they have, and from the very beginning, from 2019, they've chosen not to address the issue of ownership of data, because identifying the ownership of co-created data is a very, very complex and difficult ask. With decentralization, there is, of course, decentralization brings with it a certain amount of user inconvenience. And that's why you're seeing mostly the choice of using decentralized platforms, more of a political choice by technologists and people who don't want centralization. But invariably, for convenience, people end up moving to centralized platforms. Um, and so, therefore, I wouldn't also look at forced decentralization. And like I said earlier, governments want centralized platforms because they can regulate through them, they can control through them. And of course, people should choose decentralized platforms exactly for that. This is what we lost when we moved from the web to apps. Because in that process, apps basically brought centralization into play. The power of default on devices is what made certain apps grow. The power of app stores to recommend certain popular choices ended up cementing that popular choice. And there are levels of control in that environment that have led to centralization. So I would push for decentralization, but the point I was making was more related to fungibility of data and the issue of ownership. On community ownership of data, that again is a very tricky proposition, because like I said, if there is data that's generated from using an application or a service, can that data, who does that data belong to? It doesn't necessarily belong to the person who's using the service. It belongs to both the person who's using the service and the service that is being used. And that's typically used to improve the experience of the user. And so while one of the non-personal data papers in India looked at community ownership of data, when I looked at that construct, I just felt that this will actually lend itself to politics of data ownership, and who will monetize it, the people who will sell that data once it gets collected. Um, and we're just going to increase the complexity uh, for how things operate on the internet in terms of a new set of stakeholders. Monetizing that data is a cost in itself, and who's going to be willing to manage that will create another complex sort of a situation. In the end, you'll have the same problem as digital public infrastructure, for example, where you've replaced a duopoly of, like I said, MasterCard and Visa with a monopoly of NPCI, but another duopoly on top of that of Walmart and Google. So, we're just going to end up with the same problem in a different mechanism, is what I'm saying. On sovereignty, just in response to what Shognik had said, if you go back to 2015, the conversation around sovereignty of data in India began when Bhavish Agarwal of Ola and Sachin Bansal, then of Flipkart, talked about capital dumping at the Carnegie India Summit. because they were competing with Amazon and Uber, and they did not have access to that kind of capital. They had to every time they had to raise capital uh, uh, and dilute their own ownership in order to compete with such large players that have raised more capital globally. But it works another way as well. Let's not forget that the same players had raised money from venture capitalists to kill competition, like for example, Ola versus Taxi for Sure. And Taxi for Sure was able to raise less money than Ola was. In the same vein, Flipkart was able to raise more money than a Let's Buy was in 2011 or 12, from what I remember, right? So um, this narrative of sovereignty, especially when it comes from businesses, is a mechanism for basically empowering themselves versus global players, and it's a competitive move in the market rather than a policy choice. It's just that India as a country is, this government in particular has picked up on that and is leveraging this situation. And I was at a meeting where Mr. Jaishankar, our external affairs minister, very clearly said that there can be no free run in India because that they view as economic suicide. Um, and that India is going to leverage the geopolitical situation to further its growth, its businesses, and leverage the geopolitical situation the same way China did in the 70s and 80s. So we are going to see that this is more opportunistic than anything else. And someone's going to make money at the end of it, but none of this is really based on principles of civil liberties. These are market mechanisms. Thanks.
Questions actually.
There are questions here. One is from Shahana. I can't find it for some reason. I think it's in the chat.
There was one from Satya as well.
Okay. Nikhil, there's a question for you. It says, thanks for a great presentation. This is from Shahana Udupa. How are domestic entities developing their strategies for AI models that can be deployed for political discourse? Is the state quoting domestic players in this regard?
So I think one of the things, so what we're seeing largely in terms of the political discourse is that there are political parties that are reaching out to technology players, especially those who have voice and video capabilities for deepfakes. And deepfakes can have positive use cases. Like, for example, there was a video of Karunanidhi, um, you know, basically wishing his party well. There have been multiple deepfakes. I've forgotten a couple of other politicians around that. And these are Indian companies that are basically looking at this opportunity for getting business from political parties. The other is, I think we saw Bhashini, which is being developed by the state, which is used by the Prime Minister in one of his speeches in early on to live translate his speech into another language. Um, Now, there are two ways of looking at that. One is that this is disingenuous because he doesn't speak the language. But the other way of looking at it is that he's able to communicate to another player, another set of stakeholders. And this can be available to all political parties in an election, but obviously the state shouldn't be providing it. So capabilities already exist. AI capabilities in terms of voice, there's a company called Dubverse that's been around since 2011, and they've been building voice translation capabilities as well. But I think these are very early days in terms of deep political deployment. We'll probably see more as we go along. Uh, I don't think there's uh, that much work being done right now. These are early days, and remember, voice and video are more difficult to do than text is. And text-based generative capabilities have been in use now for a few years.
Thank you. There's a question for Matt. I'll pin you in a second. It says, can you share, this is from Abdullah. He says, can you share some insights on datafication and surveillance of online resistance regarding what is happening in Gaza? Yesterday, I was in Cambridge standing at an otherwise peaceful protest, but somebody was shouting that we are terrorists. I believe this ideology translates, replicates in the digital realm to control or disempower the digital subjects so that they lose their voices. Could you come in here, Matt? Nikhil, I'm going to unpin you and I'm going to pin Matt. Give me a second. Add pin. Yeah, Matt, you've been pinned. I think you can turn on your camera as well.
Great. Yeah, I'm happy to comment on this. Thank you. And also just to say solidarity with the protesters and the folks that are currently sitting in the encampments in front of King's College in Cambridge and many other universities around the world. Listen, I think it's no secret that platforms have tended towards imposing the same kind of hegemonic discourses and normative notions of what is seen as politically permissible and non-permissible in the online sphere. We don't need to only sort of limit our lens to what's been happening since the start of the war and the genocide in Gaza. You know, even going back to 2021 and the eviction of Sheikh Jarrah, we saw how some of the auto-translate functions of Meta in particular were leading to things like Al-Aqsa and Palestine being automatically translated into terrorism online. And of course, this reflects in the users that are seeing this. And since, of course, the start of the siege, we've seen numerous different flops, including these, which have seen Palestinian flags and calls for a free Palestine be translated into, again, terrorism or other words that would be seen as derogatory, which of course Meta and X claim are unintended consequences of the threshold within which they set their algorithms to either translate certain things in particular ways or also protect users from seeing particular messaging. This we've seen in the amount of shadow bans that have been happening. Of course, again, since the start of the siege, you will have noticed that, especially in the initial 3 months, that content that was coming out of the occupied Palestinian territories and indeed the Middle East and North Africa region at large would have been subject to temporary emergency risk measures that saw the dampening of content that would have been indicated as violent be moved down in terms of the threshold required, right? So where previously a requirement of the threshold being met of 80% was needed by, for example, Meta, that threshold was moved down to 20%. Meanwhile, for other language content, the actual threshold remained the same. So what you see is an asymmetric skewing towards both drowning out and quieting voices that are speaking for a free Palestine, which of course reflects very much the live and offline discourse that has been at play since 1948, whilst at the same time seeing the translation of content that speaks to a free Palestine into what is being seen as, inherently deviant, again, drawing on this orientalizing gaze of situating the Palestinian and Palestinian discourse and Palestinian affiliated discourse as fundamentally deviant and fundamentally terrorist and fundamentally opposite. And so, yeah, I think what your analysis is speaking to there, I think, is very much the case. Of course, tech platforms themselves often speak to the idea that this isn't the case and that they're always looking to improve the temporary risk measures, but that they simply can't do it at a pace that matches the reality of things. Interestingly, they'll say that things would have been much worse if they haven't intervened, which is also a discourse that tech companies tend to use. I see your message in the chat as well, Carrie. There are a few reports, in particular, a report that came out on shadow banning by Human Rights Watch that was released in January this year. And there are a few different press releases from November and October 2023 from Amnesty that speaks specifically to monitoring both the shadow banning as well as the discriminatory translation work that is happening at Meta and at X. And there are a number of other papers that are in the making on this general topic around, can the Palestinian and the digital Palestinian, as it were, speak? And I can link these either in the chat or send them around in an email to participants as well.
Have some time. We have 5 minutes. Suruchi, would you like to comment? Yeah. Sorry, we're going to play musical chairs one more time.
I think the initial question was also like, how we are to look at, centralized, data infrastructures. So I kind of want to, like expand the discussion a little bit and kind of draw attention to kind of Web3 platforms such as blockchain. Like initially, they were actually looked upon as, a spaces for decentralized data spaces, but later on there are critics which have said that they are actually re-centralize at the same time, and this is like an observation. But I also want to ask the other panelists to kind of comment, observe on this. Like while have been critiques of how blockchains have also kind of emerged as tools of surveillance, of data of different marginalized groups such as refugee and exile populations in different places, but also at the same time certain refugee exile groups have seen certain benefits in the blockchain in creating certain digital identity. So how we are when it comes to the opportunities and challenges of these of these centralized networks, how should we look at these platforms also maybe? So, I just kind of wanted to throw this question, and since we have some time, other panelists might want to kind of come in here.
I have a comment on this, if I may.
Yes, yeah.
So blockchain is basically is like an open database in a sense, right? And it's just an inefficient, decentralized database. So it will contain data, and that data can be used to identify people, because a blockchain basically points towards where all that data is stored. So I think we need to understand that um, blockchains are by their very inherent nature very, very inefficient, but they are databases. And so whether they will be used to identify, they will be used to store data, um, uh, and a decentralized platform that uses blockchain basically decentralizes the identification um, or the validation of the data across the blockchain, because different nodes will have the will have copies of the data, and updating a database requires the updating of multiple nodes. And so, I think we need to understand how blockchains work uh, uh, before we look at it from as being different from databases. They're just decentralized databases. I think Mac wants to jump in.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here just a few different notes on the sort of blockchain discourse. I think in particular for refugee and marginalized communities that don't have privileged movement status, we've seen time and time again how the very immutable nature around which information is stored leads to the kinds of abuses that one might expect to see when it comes to exactly these populations who are seen as lesser and not deserving as internationally guaranteed human rights that say states offer citizens in some contexts. You see individuals who are tied to identities in ways that means they can't escape identities that they might be persecuted for. And sort of these tools that often are offered for refugees are ones that require them to tie themselves with any documentation and available evidence that they have from who they were, where they came from. It forecloses the possibility of flexibilization strategies, which is what refugees and asylum seekers often rely on, which is to say the destruction of a former identity in order to take up a new one that isn't subject to persecution. It also forecloses the possibility of other strategies, including the assumption of an identity of a relative, for example, who may either have deceased or who may be elsewhere. Again, in an effort to seek safety without having their information and their personal information compromised. And so I think we have to acknowledge, as Nikhil is saying as well, that blockchain isn't a panacea, and often it runs short on many of the same fronts that centralized data storage does too. But I do want to just tease out a sort of I guess, an underpinning discussion that maybe we haven't had as much, and I don't know if we'll have time for it today, but can we talk about data colonialism and AI without also exposing and breaking apart the constructed nature of the data in and of itself? So I'm sensing throughout our conversations that there is a bit of a tension between, on the one hand, utilizing data protection protocols and thinking about the structures around which data is set up, whether it's decentralized or centralized, where these are available, and sort of challenging the ownership models of the data, while on the other hand, contesting the conjecture-based nature of the data and categories we are collapsed into itself. What are the myths that are underpinning their justification? Some of this is, for example, traceable in debiasing efficiency and accuracy narratives. The idea that if we just give something more data, or if we just give something more access to the production of data, that we'll have better outcomes and better technologies that lead to less bias and more efficiency and more accuracy. But it sort of over focuses the discussion on data regulation, and instead sort of, I think, distracts from moving our focus to resisting the infrastructures that own AI discourses to begin with. So rather than thinking about ways in which we can own our own data, I think getting back to the premise of what that data looks like in the first place, and whether that data is useful, and whether the infrastructures that they feed into in the first place should at all be permissible, I think is something that maybe we can and should discuss as well.
All right, thank you everybody for joining us. We will take a short break for lunch and resume at 2 o'clock. That's which is half an hour away. So for everybody who is not on the Indian Standard Time, please budget 30 more minutes to the next panel. Thank you so much, Kerry, for coming in as well. I'm just seeing your comment here.
And thanks to all the panelists.
And thank you to all the panelists, Suruchi, Shagnik, Nikhil, Matt, and Kerry. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
जब आपका सेशन हो जाएगा। हेलो यार, वो दीपक भेजा, उससे तो वैसे भी नहीं होगा मेरे।
हेलो।
हाँ राहुल भैया, मैं ऑडिबल।
हाँ, यस यू आर। मेरी आवाज आ रही है अभी?
हाँ हाँ, क्लियर।
क्लियर है?
हाँ
ठीक है।
हेलो राहुल भाई, आई एम ऑडिबल। हेलो हेलो। अरे वो मीटिंग शाम तक चलेगी, रहने दे।
हाँ, अभी अभी मेरी आवाज आ रही है आपको?
हाँ अभी आ रही है।
मैम, आप भी बोल सकते हो कुछ। संगम,
हाँ
कैन यू हियर द मैम?
या
तो कैन यू हियर मी?
यस यस।
दैट विल बी। संगम,
यस।
थोड़ा सा कुछ बोलो। थोड़ा कुछ भी बोलो, थोड़ा लंबा बोलना मगर।
हाँ हाँ हाँ, अभी आवाज मेरी आ रही है। हेलो 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 हेलो।
मच बेटर।
क्या?
ओके ओके ओके
गुड।
ओके, गुड।
ओके।
Hi.
Hello there. Can you hear me fine?
Yes, I can hear you. How are you all?
Fine, and you?
Waking up.
Oh gosh, it must be so early for you. Because yeah, I thought it was relatively early for Raphael and I, but it must be very early for you.
Hello, Carrie.
Hi, it's lovely to meet you. You're coming up as Shagnik at the moment.
No, don't know why.
I had this problem this morning as well. Are you able to rename yourself, or will it not
Uh,
let you?
I don't know. Let me just check. Rename, yes, I can.
Okay, perfect.
Here we go.
Amazing. I think Ruchir has just said they're starting in a minute, so I guess they'll be turning on the Jindal side soon. Perfect. Oh, no.
So camera then, because
Let's
otherwise
start
they
with
can't
the
see.
Camera is on, mic is on.
Hi, we can see you.
Yeah, sure. So let's get started.
Yeah, shall we get started?
Yes.
We can get started.
Hi everyone. Hi, welcome back, and hi, hello, Ranjit, Rafael, and hi Jane. Thanks for joining in. Shall we start the session now?
Start.
Okay, shall we begin? Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Hiking. Where's hiking? Got it.
Just wait.
Okay, so sure. I mean, now we are currently, welcome back after the break, and we are now currently in our second panel. We are going to talk about platforms, news, and disinformation, largely kind of also focusing largely on the politics of platforms. And we have like great lineup of speakers. We have Professor Hai-Chin Liu. She's she's a professor of media and communication and ARC Future Fellow at RMIT University, and she's also a chief investigator at the RMIT's node of ARC Center of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. And she is also interested in the Chinese digital platforms, communication and culture, and their socio-political and cultural impact in China, Australia, and the Asia Pacific. We also have Ranjit Singh, who is a senior researcher at Data and Society, and he conducts qualitative research for the algorithmic Impact Methods Lab. Singh's work examines the everyday experiences of people subject to data-driven practices and follows the mutual shaping of their lives and their data records, aiming to understand how data is increasingly used to imagine and develop new digital solutions for democratizing inclusion. And we also have Rafael Hernandez. He's a research assistant at the Liverpool Center for the Future of Intelligence, University of Cambridge. And also, more importantly, he's also had a decade-long background in journalism, mostly writing about technology, society issues. And some of these years were spent at Folha de Sao Paulo, Brazil's leading newspaper, I hope I pronounce it correctly, and where he worked as a data analyst, reporter, and editor at large. He has also managed projects that applied data and AI in the newsroom. He runs the project Privacy for Journalists, which focuses on raising cybersecurity awareness among reporters, and he's a managing director for the Cambridge Journal of Artificial Intelligence. So shall we begin this session with Professor Liu?
Thank you, Suruchi, for the introduction. Thank you all for coming today to this panel. Talking about data colonialism is a huge topic, as we know from the panel one. You even just talking about geopolitics, there's a lot going on. By putting me in the panel on platform news and this information, I think maybe I'll just choose a small case to illustrate what I mean based on my research on Chinese Australians' discussion on the voice referendum to the parliament that happened last year. But first of all, I just wanted to have a little bit discussion about the background about the data colonialism as a quotidian activities. Basically, it's about the colonization of everyday life. So we talk about data as the new oil, which has captured the fundamental logic of digital capitalism. We know capitalism today is driven by data extraction and exploitation. Data colonialism has become the default model of surveillance capitalism, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I won't go on to all this. What I want to say is that quotidian activities are valorized as data, and we ourselves have become the data and the targets of profitable data extraction and exploitation, which is the central logic of Kodri and Mejia's book called The Cost of Connection, How Data is Colonizing Human Life and Appropriating It for Capitalism. So they point out that data, I quote, data colonialism is what happens when life becomes the input of capitalism and becomes organized through data relations, end quote. So Kodri and Mejias argue that the expansion of data colonialism is both external, meaning geographically expanding, and internal, which concerns with social governance. So China is often cited as an example of internal colonization, particularly when it comes to data. China is always called the colonizer within. Via its various AI surveillance applications and digital platforms and projects like Golden Shield, Safe Cities, Sharp Eyes, and the social credit system, China has built an expansive digital empire within and beyond its borders. The social credit system, which is the core research project I have been engaging and been funded for for 4 years, full-time, no teaching, how lucky I am. It's always cited as an example of the social quantification sector in China. There are also misunderstandings and misconceptualizations about the social credit system, which we know is more than one system, which is more than just social control or surveillance. I don't have the time to go into the details, but what I wanted to point out is that the implication of the social credit system is part of China's experimental authoritarianism. It is rooted in Chinese historical legacy in governance. There was no tech then, and implemented under existing administrative and bureaucratic structure from no tech and low tech to high tech. So when we talk about colonizers without, we talk about the US as a data colonizer. We also talk about China as a new data colonizer, particularly in Global South. So we know capitalist surveillance is about data and intelligence gathering for the purpose of furthering an economic agenda. Most popular social media platforms and websites that we in the West are owned by the US corporations such as Facebook, Google, Twitter, or X, and YouTube. The US empire has monopolized the collection of the user data worldwide, not just the users within the US territory. And the dominance of US-based technology firms in Global South, with the exception of countries like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, has followed the US National Security Agency unprecedented access to foreign populations. Their dominance over data colonialism is now being challenged by the Chinese. China's AI not only has made great impact on the Chinese society, but also through the infrastructure projects such as the Belt and Road Initiative. The increasingly presence of Chinese AI and the information technology companies in Africa, Southeast Asia, which is my focus, and other places raises lots of concerns about China exporting digital authoritarianism. This is despite the empirical research by scholars that argues against the Team China rhetoric. Such as Yu Jiahe from the University of Kentucky finds that Chinese digital platforms largely undertook their overseas expansion based on commercial interests. And the Beijing's high-level policy framework, Belt Road Initiative, has had a very limited impact on the expansion of the privately owned Chinese platforms and their local business operations within the host countries in Southeast Asia. I have been doing research about Chinese tech expansion, particularly with digital transaction platforms expansion in Southeast Asia. And I have found, very briefly, so one, Chinese social media platforms and its internet in general follow and serve Chinese tourists and migrants, such as the use of WeChat. So I'll come back to the topic on WeChat in Australia in a minute. And secondly, they have been going overseas since the turn of the 21st century, or even in the last century, driven by market imperatives of expansion and the financial logic for growth in profit. Three, they all take a globalizing strategy to diversify supply chains and minimize risks by investing in and buying local startups through mergers and acquisitions. And four, at the same time, sitting the crosshair between China and the US competition, the tech companies and consumers in Southeast Asia have taking a pragmatic approach to geopolitics. Rather than choosing sides, lots of them have welcomed technologies, expertise, and investments from both sides. As the Chinese saying goes, the fisherman, which is the Southeast Asia I refer to, has stood the benefit in the fight between the crane and the clam, which is China and the US. All right. Well, I mentioned the central role of digital tech platforms and digital tech companies and their platforms as gatekeepers, not just the Western platforms, as we know the big fours, but also the Chinese big tech platforms such as Tencent's WeChat, Alibaba's platforms, ByteDance platforms, TikTok and Douyin, etc. They all work with national governments as gatekeepers of communication and transactions across financial, social, cultural, and political domains. Chinese tech companies are accused of working with the Chinese government to roll out mass surveillance technological systems from and the devices from facial and voice recognition or authentication technologies to credit rating and supervision databases. Because of the connected nature of the online environment, today's gatekeeping power by the platforms has consequences on vast global scale, not just within any particular geopolitical boundaries. As Kodri and Magius point out, all the data generated and captured through the hardware and the software via platforms is processed by two other important types of players in the social quantification sector. One is the data analytics firms, and the other is data brokerage firms. I would want to point out further that it is a big business, particularly since most projects are government contract jobs and are generally funded by us taxpayers' money. Like other all-American counterparts, Chinese tech companies and their platforms are not charity organizations. They are driven by capitalist drive for growth and expansion. Of course, they choose. They have close connection with the Chinese government. It has implications for platform users, but I caution the geopolitical lens when viewing everything in relation to China and the Chinese. The colonization of the life world via platforms has more serious consequences for average consumers in everyday life, particularly when it comes to political communication, than the geopolitical framing of the big power rivalry between China and the US. Okay, so now I'll just come to the focus of my presentation today, which is the platformization of persuasion in post-truth communication. So in Manufacturing Consent, we know the book that was published in 1988, Herman and Chomsky argue that mass communication media are particularly those in the US, when they wrote the book, are effective, quote, effective and powerful ideological institutions that carry out a system-supported propaganda function by reliance on market forces, internalized assumptions, and self-censorship, and without overt coercion, quote. That kind of propaganda model of communication is still relevant today in the era of social media and digital communication. The propaganda model continues to be relevant because we argue that, one, traditional media themselves have occupied the internet and are now dominant news providers on all social media platforms. And two, they have the resources. They are generally funded. They have also pre-existing audience to give them the advantage over the so-called community media or any other alternative media potential rivals. And three, we know that they all rely on advertising model for profit. That kind of advertising model can compromise the alternative operators on the internet when seeking advertising revenue to fund their operations. And we all know that alternative media have limited resources, and also they have limited outreach. They also have limited special expertise in critical in news making or agenda setting. So lots of them engage in critical analysis rather than agenda setting. Okay, 4, much of what people do on social media platforms is oriented towards social connection, like social networking, rather than rational discussion or debate in ideal public sphere. Lots of times politics comes the second at best. So we live in a era of communicative abundance and the post-truth politics, where networked digital platforms shape practically everything and every institution in our daily lives, from information communication to economic and social transactions. Digital platforms have enabled truth-telling and emotionally driven process and rendered boundary between information and misinformation contestable. Well, I used the case, the opinion battle between the yes and no campaigners among Chinese Australians during the Indigenous Voice to referendum in Australia from September to October 2023. I use this small case to show how opinions, often dressed up as information or misinformation, is platformatized to persuade. So I wanted to use this case to illustrate not just how important the social media platforms are, whether they are Chinese platforms or American platforms, in normalizing the platformization of persuasion among networked publics across platforms, but also the importance for us to go beyond geopolitics, to look at, to come back to the basics about when we look at human communication. And the case can be viewed as a consequence of data colonialism in the hybrid media environment. When I say hybrid, it's not just hybrid between the traditional media or the traditional media, but also hybrid in terms of language, whether it's the English language media or other language media, such as the Chinese language media, whether they are the platforms made in China or made in the US. So people in Australia, Chinese migrants like myself in Australia, have access to both English and the Chinese language media, and we also have access to all sorts of platforms if we make an effort. So the Voice referendum is a failed attempt to alter the Australian constitution to recognize and enable Indigenous Australians, the First Nations, to make representations to the Parliament and the executive government on matters relating to them. Public debate around the referendum intensified in the September and early October last year. It was extremely politicized and characterized by a gray zone of information that challenges the boundary of what is information or disinformation. Okay, lots of information have been circulated on social media platforms, from Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok to WeChat and Little Red Book, 小红书, which is the Chinese one. So we have seen particularly the yes and no campaigners being active on WeChat and the Red Xiaohongshu, which are called Red, the two most popular social media platforms among global Chinese population. They not just talk about all the information, circular information in Chinese. Lots of the information actually is copy and paste the links or the information from the mainstream Australian government media sources, or from the both yes campaigners and the no campaigns. Those discussions were led by some prominent Chinese community leaders. They shared information and commentaries in various chat groups and the channels on these platforms, and they also post on Twitter, and then copy and paste the link or the screenshot of what they have talked about on Twitter on WeChat chat groups. While the yes campaigners appeal to emotion, the no campaigners banked on people's fear of change, as in their slogan, if you don't know, vote no. And they also appeal to their fear about the race-based social division if the referendum passed. Both campaigns were active across all sorts of platforms. Original contents were shared across these platforms. Screenshots of the comments were also widely shared to support one's claims and discredit the other. The yes campaigners were very active, while the no campaigners were accused of spreading misinformation or being the victim of misinformation. So I have a screenshot which I can't share. I may be able to share later on. In one particular group, which share this among the three people that I know them personally, and they have been long-term Chinese migrants to Australia for a long time, since 1999, and the other is been to Australia, since 2000. And they all have PhDs. Two of them have PhD degrees, and one's a lawyer, and they all have had, have professional jobs and read English very well. You can't say that because they support this camp or rather than the other camp because of the Chinese influence, because it has nothing to do with China. And also China has no interest, I would argue, has no interest in influencing how the Chinese Australians vote on this matter. And these people don't just read Chinese, they read English, they access British English, American or Australian, or Al Jazeera, or South China Morning Post, anything that they can get hold of, because there's no censorship law in Australia, right? So those people like myself are fluent in English. We talk to people in English. We work in English working environment, and therefore, when there's a report that earlier this year coming out accusing the Chinese government for interference on WeChat to influence Chinese Australians' voting preferences, I just laughed at it, as if we are still brainwashed, having lived in Australia for such a long time, being educated in Australia, working in Australia, and adopted Australian citizenship, and still being dumb and easily brainwashed, and by using the Chinese social media platforms, and therefore we are subject to the Chinese misinformation. I argue against such simplistic argument. So sorry, I have to move for my line to go on. It's automatic decision making. Anyway, so what we have seen, both camps accusing each other. When they disagree with each other, they accuse each other of spreading misinformation, and then the other person will say, "Hey, do some fact check," and the no campaigner will say, "Yes, I have. My fact check tells me that you are spreading misinformation," and then the kind of misinformation, the term misinformation has been weaponized. So we all know that AI-driven social media platforms are more than intermediaries. They drive the ongoing digital revolution in all aspects of our lives. But we also know that they have been collaborating with key players in the Iron Triangle. Money, which is the business, power, politics, and knowledge, which are the intellect. Who produce so much rhetorics about what they think we should know. So that is the ruling class bloc, entrenched in national and transnational networks alliance, play an important role via their platforms to order space, make time, and manage political messaging. We also know that these platform capitalists capitalize on our active engagement with their services, their functions, and their partnerships, and therefore the information flow on and across these different social media platforms is designed as a socially driven experience the path and the fault lines of information as well as misinformation are determined by platform algorithms as well as organic networks and their varying degree of affinity and the trust in people's different social circles. So in my case study, the yes and no campaigners are not necessarily foot soldiers of foreign government's misinformation campaign. Accusing opponents of spreading or falling victim to misinformation was their impulse to defend their own position. It nevertheless became a quick but lazy mechanism to dismiss others' opinions and stop further discussions. Truth claiming is hence an emotionally driven process, and the boundary between information and disinformation becomes contestable in a sea of opinions. All right, so in the era of post-truth communication, truth and the misinformation are multiple and immutable. Reality is a matter of interpretation and dominated by opinion and emotions, especially when there's a breakdown of social trust in established expertise and institutions like journalism and the news media. What counts as truth or facts vary across time and space and agency. What is taken as truth by some may be considered as misinformation by others. All social media platforms can be turned into narrative machines by post-truth performances from individuals or organized forces or groups of forces. The platformization of persuasion is not just a Chinese feature on Chinese social media super app platforms like WeChat. It is part of a meaning-making and sense-making struggle in ongoing digital transformation beyond platform studies. So I won't go into the literature review on, the Habermas idea of the colonization of life world by data-driven technological systems. What I wanted to point out in the end of my talk is that, active audience analysts, beware. It is true that we as consumers or audiences we have our agency. We can pick and choose among media offerings, but only within the limits of what the media and the platforms will offer or we will recommend. The audiences are not sovereign, even if we have us freedom of choice and the freedom of speech. We should also keep in mind that propagandists have the power via their platform algorithms to raise the frequency and intensity of their propaganda campaign and adjust the style of messaging based on our individual preferences. So my second beware is the digital authoritarianism researchers. When it comes to China, and particularly when it comes to data colonization or colonialism, lots of research has been produced within the framework of geopolitics. Okay, so they look at how AI is used to manipulate information on WeChat, which I mentioned, that was just one small example. But I would argue that we need to look at this whole issue beyond the so-called class, gender, race, or even the geopolitical boundaries to look at how data colonialism is our collective problem. It's not a Chinese platform or problem or American platform. It's our collective problem. How do we make any progress when our target is precisely the platform that we use every day? It's precisely the wider economic, social, and political order that produces those digital social media platforms that we use and we donate our data every day. And I sound a little bit, cynical, but I wanted to remain optimistic in the age of depression in political communication. But how? I don't know. So I'll end my talk now. Thanks.
Thank you, hi, Professor. I think that's a kind of lot of food for thought, and I'm sure we'll have a discussion at the end of the session. But now I invite Dr. Ranjit Singh to come in.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to quickly share my screen, and I hope this works. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Perfect. So I think it's hiking sets up the conversation really well. So, what I'm going to do is to basically talk a little bit about really the basic everyday experience of being on platforms and what that to a certain extent does for thinking about questions of disinformation. And primarily the focus of the talk is kind of focused more on everyday experience and a little away from the broader formalization of what we would basically articulate as data colonialism. And the way I'm going to do it is that I'm going to first introduce myself. My name is Ranjit. I am from the Data and Society Research Institute. And Data and Society has had a history of basically working on media manipulation and disinformation. We've been basically, we kind of took on this project in 2020, a little after, a little after that. And a little earlier than that. So, 2018, 2019, 2020. And part of the work that we were basically trying to do was to understand what is really happening in the landscape of media disinformation in the United States, specifically focusing on the census as it was happening in the 2020s, and thinking through the different kinds of ways in which disinformation campaigns were being run in the United States. In that context, I think the one thing that I still find deeply relevant is this distinction that one of the reports draws out between deepfakes and cheapfakes. And I think that, partly this is important given the context in which we are currently operating, where we are thinking through what it means to actually have AI produce deepfakes in one way or the other. Of course, deepfakes are computationally intensive. They are designed to basically represent reality that isn't there, but at the same time, their cheap fakes are equally effective. The point being that if you can change the timestamp on a video, that is equally a good way of basically talking about a particular information or misrepresenting what really happened at what moment of time. So to a certain extent, the way in which we think about what this distinction looks like and why we are worried more about deep fakes as opposed to normal natural ways of basically just editing a photo or a video to basically elicit certain kinds of information landscape. It's primarily because it's easier to detect cheap fakes as opposed to deep fakes. But at the same time, in the context of the way in which information circulates, you can easily see how, that distinction doesn't really matter when it comes to basically thinking about how people receive this information and how they think through it. But at the same time, what it allows us to do is to basically parse out what is the landscape of the information that we are operating in and how we can actually start thinking about the different kinds of responses that we can come up with in the context of this particular use of AI in the context of deepfakes. My work, on the other hand, is broadly focused on AI in and from the majority world. I have been thinking through what the conceptual vocabulary of how Global South scholars think about AI. And one of the core distinctions that I have been able to identify is that there is when you look at the AI ethics literature of Global North scholars, they kind of tend to focus on keywords such as fairness, bias, transparency, explainability, human-centered design. And in each of these cases, AI is kind of imagined as a tool that can be improved through design. And if you look at the vocabulary of majority world scholars or Global South scholars, you will see that they use key terms like extraction, colonialism, solidarity, dignity, which are fundamentally based on thinking about AI as an everyday experience. And I take that particular insight of thinking through ordinary stories of everyday experiences with these systems as a way to invite us to start thinking more about what does it mean for us to actually tell stories of being subject to data and living with it on an everyday basis. So what I'm going to do today is to basically talk about the middle part of this body of work, which is Parables of AI in and from the majority world. And what I'm going to do is to basically take you through two stories. Both of them are about platforms and submitted to the collection by storytellers. One of them is based in Lebanon, the other one is based in India. And then we will think through, to some extent, what does these two stories tell us about the way in which we can respond to issues of disinformation and platform news broadly. So the broader framing within which we can learn and think through these stories is the notion of ordinary ethics. I borrowed this from Veena Das. It's a way to basically think about ethics that is grounded in everyday decisions and ordinary judgments rather than broad universal values. And it's an invitation to basically descend into the ordinary and think a little bit more about what's really going on an everyday basis when we think about some of these issues that we are currently talking about when it comes to platform disinformation. So the first story is called Capitalizing on Crisis and Hope, Immigration and Social Media Ad Targeting in Lebanon. Sacha Rubamed, when she submitted this story, she's a social media expert. She's been working on, and she's based in Lebanon. And one of the reasons for how this story came about was that she encountered these advertisements that she was looking at on Facebook about immigrating to Canada or Greece. And one of the ways in which she kind of takes on the invitation of these advertisements was to start looking at or ask herself, why is she receiving these advertisements? And the story kind of builds on this particular question of why she's seeing these ads, and then circles out from, is it something that she, about her, and the ads are clearly personalized and targeted. So, is it something about her that she's actually looking at these ads? Is it something about the network of friends that she has that kind of creates the conditions for her to basically be, invited to see these ads? And then finally, she reflects back onto the broader Syrian refugee crisis ongoing in Lebanon during this time, to start thinking about whether this is a response to the broader Syrian refugee crisis and the ways in which the aspiration of being able to leave then plays on the way in which social media ad targeting is organized. I love this story primarily because what it does is that it invites us to think a little bit more about what is really going on when we see something on our newsfeed. And the layers of meaning that you can associate with it if you kind of take any particular post as a point of departure to start thinking about why is it that you're seeing what you're seeing. And it opens up this possibility of thinking about algorithms, not just as curated, pieces of streams of information, but also as an invitation to broadly think about what is really your role in this particular space and how do you actually interpret what this stream is trying to tell you and how do you make sense of it. The way in which this, one of them goes, one of my most favorite parts of the story is this quote where Sacha observes that when we see ads on billboards or other physical forms, we know other people around us are experiencing them too. But online and mediated by the algorithm, we do not exactly see what others are seeing, if they're being shown the same adverts as we are or not. Who else comprised the target audience of the ads I kept seeing in my social media news feeds? What others seeing the same ads? Were others seeing the same ads that were capitalizing on crisis and hope? And I think that question is deeply relevant to the way in which we think about what does it mean to actually reflect on the nature of personalization as it kind of becomes a part of our everyday experience of thinking about some of these new adverts or any post that you see on social media. It also brings up this question of, to what extent and when does something become personalized? Is it something about you that you're looking at something, or is it something about the nature or the everyday conversation that is happening around you that you're looking at something? And I think that kind of connects back to the way in which Hiking was talking about the case that she's, mentioning around, responses to the First Nation policies, primarily because, to say yes or no puts you in a particular bracket, which allows you to basically experience the information landscape around your social media in a different way. And then you're framed in that context in a peculiar way as well. So personalization has these larger consequences that emerge from this particular one sort of context within which you're seeing what these ads are doing and how the information that is being presented to you is different from information that is presented to somebody else. The second story is about annotation. And this one is about a tool that was being developed which was designed to basically identify, gender abuse on social media, especially Twitter. And it was kind of and the idea behind building this tool was basically to figure out whether we can actually get a set of annotators to identify and build a crowdsourced data set that allows us to basically think through whether a post that you see online is gender-based violence or not. And then once you have a data set that is curated, what you can do is that you can train a machine learning algorithm on this data set and then hopefully automate the detection of the kinds of posts that kind of represent gender-based violence. What I found fascinating about this story, as Chester puts it, is how she describes the process of actually organizing workshops in order to design this tool. One of the core challenges that they were facing was to basically figure out how do you actually align all the annotators to basically be, consistent in the way in which they're noting what it means to actually, make annotations on a particular post as being gender-based violence. So I'm going to take you through another quote from the story as a way to think through one of the core challenges of the challenge of annotation and what it looks like. So Chester notes, the tyranny of the machine still demanded that different annotators agree with each other to an extent. To help with that, we had a set of instructions, and we came up with 3 labels. 1, is it gendered abuse when not directed? Is it gendered abuse when directed at persons of marginalized gender and sexuality? Is it explicit or aggressive? The expert annotators had to look at the post through 3 different lenses: the text of the post, who it was directed towards, and the perceived tone of the post. They had to read a post without a context, imagine an average context to use, or imagine the best case scenario. As per our calculation, they had to annotate 40 posts in an hour. They had to forget and imagine the best, average, and the worst for each post every 1.5 minutes. In the process, we had indeed created the perfect torture machine for our annotators. The core challenge of thinking through some of these issues is that we are constantly trying to think about, 1, what is the experience of being on social media and experiencing the posts that we are seeing, and then how do we ensure that this space is safe? And the 2 stories, to a certain extent, kind of speak to these larger issues of thinking about what does it mean for a feed to be personalized, and what does it mean for a piece to be for a post to be annotated for certain kinds of content moderation. And in both of these cases, what we are seeing is that the ordinary ways in which people kind of try to rationalize what is happening in the context of what they're doing is fundamentally grounded in really ordinary judgments on how do I organize this? What is the right way of basically thinking about some of these questions? Is it abuse when it is directed, and is it not abuse if it's not directed? And I think that is a core question of thinking about how do we actually start to basically rationalize what the space looks like and who is it for, and how do we actually start thinking through what are the core ways in which we can actually reshape it in order for us to be able to actually talk about what disinformation landscape looks like and where are the ways in which we can intervene into it. So in thinking about this larger question of intervening, I was trying to think through what are the different ways in which we can actually intervene into the space. And I offer a broad set of 3 responses to disinformation as a way to think about some of these issues. The first one is, of course, becoming literate. It's the idea that you must have the competency of knowing, engaging with, and evaluating disinformation within media content. And the simplest example of this is fact checking. But at the same time, it's kind of inviting us to think about, okay, when we look at something, can we take a step back and think about this, whether this is true or not is a question that we need to answer for ourselves. And to some extent, we kind of take it for granted that if it is on a particular kind of media, it must be true. But that is an open question. And ordinarily, we need to be open to the idea that we are not only questioning what we are seeing, but also to be able to actually figure out whether what we are seeing could potentially be triangulated in terms of information across a wide variety of sources that we can actually look at. The second part of it is becoming responsible, which I kind of imagine as the ability to respond to disinformation within media content and a commitment to govern it as a stakeholder. The kinds of annotation that we were talking about in Cheshta's story are kind of designed to flag things, right? They're basically an invitation to basically think through, okay, this post seems to be inappropriate for this reason or that reason. And, flagging in itself has its own set of politics, but at the same time, it's one of the initial tools that we can use in order to start thinking about what's really going on in the space and how can I participate in the context of thinking through what this information looks like and do I find it inappropriate and why do I find it inappropriate? And then finally, the last thing is, of course, making a contribution, which is finally, thinking through relying on your own standpoint and expertise to articulate the implications of disinformation within media content. This could simply be a question of, moderating locally within your own WhatsApp group and saying that whatever you're seeing seems to be incorrect for a wide variety of reasons. It's interesting how we all take on this role every once in a while in a conversation with a family member, but at the same time, we can actually imagine this as a way to basically invite a broader conversation on when is it that we speak up, and what is it that makes us think about that this is a moment that we need to actually respond to the kind of post that we are looking at and the kind of landscape that is creating in the group that we are participating in. So broadly, these are the ways in which I imagine the space of action for the ways in which we can think about platform news and disinformation. That's all that I have. Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. As an ex-student of Shiv Vishwanathan, I'm glad that I got an opportunity to talk to all of you and looking forward to having a discussion later. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ranjit. And now we come to our next speaker, Rafael Hernandez.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for having me here. I'll try to share my screen real quick because I have some slides to show. Please do let me know if you can see them. Are you able to see me? Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'll try to follow these presentations. Just beware, an academic in training, but more importantly, I'm a journalist, so I'll try to bring in more of that point of view, from the trenches. So just a little bit of a background. So as mentioned in the introduction, I'm a journalist coming from Brazil. I've done a lot of work focusing on tech, but I also do cybersecurity awareness training, and I have this experience working with disinformation from a cybersecurity point of view, especially when it was in campaigns targeting my colleagues and former colleagues. I'll start today by talking a little bit about some research that I have been doing, which is actually focused on how AI is covered in Brazil, but it also touches a lot on the disinformation topic. The work that I'm doing is the first work to analyze the coverage of AI in Brazilian news, and it had the goal of extracting the main topics and entities represented in a little bit more than 3,000 texts published between July 1st, 2023 and February 29th, 2024 from 21 outlets in Brazil of different characteristics. We had national speaking outlets, we had state-focused outlets, traditional media, and more newer digital media outlets. This content is yet to be published, but the reason I'm talking about this is that one of the main concerns that I found in this paper in Brazilian coverage of AI is connected to deepfakes. Just first, a little note on the method that I use. So I used computational grounded theory to go through all this textual content. So I used a lot of computational methods to extract meaning from them, just to so I did some LDA topic modeling to classify the topics. Then I applied some deep reading to verify those findings, and then I confirmed all that with some additional topic modeling with per topic, use named entity recognition to identify the people who are and the organizations that are mostly mentioned in this corpus, and I use some timeline analysis to try to identify some patterns or really some patterns on how Brazilian media covers AI. So one of the things that I found is that deepfakes are one of the main topics of concern in Brazilian media when talking about AI. This can be seen across many categories in the news. So it can be seen when talking about culture, mainly because of an AI generated ad that was published in the country during that time that featured a late artist singing along with her daughter. So that sparked a lot of discussion, but it's also mentioned a lot in the context of elections and regulation around AI in the country. So I'll move on to some context about how the discussion is going on in Brazil. So Brazil has a long history with disinformation. So in the format that we see today of disinformation, online disinformation through campaigns, it can be traced back to 2010, 2012, but it really picked up around 2018 in the previous election cycle. So it's very present during election times. By internal actors. So we often, when we talk about the use of online campaigns, we often talk about other state actors influencing elections in other countries. That's not necessarily the case with Brazil. We have lots of internal actors on that space. And it got to the point where the Superior Electoral Court had to regulate specifically about deepfakes and the use of AI, thinking of the 2024 elections that we will have in October in Brazil. Brazil has a quite unique scenario where we don't really have a regulation for AI that's in place. We have some regulation that is in discussion in the Senate. We have some cases that are under discussion in the Supreme Court, but that is taking too long to have some real outcome. So the result of that is that the Superior Electoral Court has to go through the state of technology every 2 years, because we have elections every 2 years in Brazil. So we have local elections every 4 years, and then we have national elections every 4 years, and they are spread in a way that we have elections going on every 2 years. So most of the regulation that we have going on in Brazil right now regarding technology in that sphere comes from the electoral court. In Brazil, WhatsApp is huge. 75% of the population uses WhatsApp. That's 165 million people. And it's a huge problem because, as many of you know from a research standpoint, it's really hard to understand what is going on in WhatsApp because of lots of its characteristics. It's encrypted. It doesn't really do a very good job in trying to be transparent to researchers. And actually what we have been seeing from other platforms that we used to be able to see in the past. So for example, Twitter or now Facebook is closing CrowdTangle. So it's getting increasingly hard to do those kinds of analysis, because one way around that we could do it is analyzing things that are outside of WhatsApp because of how these platforms integrate. So people will have some discussions going on in WhatsApp and then move on to Twitter to something else. We could please take a look over there or take a limited look into WhatsApp, and when we can't even do that now. So I have seen plenty of times, and that's in the literature as well, as information campaigns being used to harass journalists and to cast doubt in the electoral process and the voting machine, because Brazil uses an electronic voting system since the 90s, and there has been like a very interesting way of attacking it, because even the winning candidates said that the elections were rigged. So it was quite a weird scenario that we saw in Brazil. And after Jair Bolsonaro was elected in 2018, we saw that propaganda machine move into the federal government, because he had what was called the Office of Hatred, a few meters away from his own office, operating a propaganda machine to assassinate reputation of political dissidents, to try to push his own agenda using disinformation systematically, using public funding for that. Most of the attacks that we see will connect to what we saw in the previous panel as cheap fakes, because like most of those are low complexity attacks and high impact campaigns. So we saw a whole ecosystem forming in Brazil, where we had pretty much a top-down structure with some actors trying to dictate the agenda for the day, but we also had some spontaneous ecosystem going on to try to really get that information out there. So the example that we have on the left is from some attacks that targeted a colleague of mine after she reviewed the scheme that allowed this propaganda machine to happen. So they said that she was soliciting in exchange for scoops. So they started comparing her to prostitutes and use lots of images, really graphic images of that. And the image from the right is from after then candidate Jair Bolsonaro was stabbed and he was still recovering from the hospital. He started targeting the election system, saying that the elections were rigged, and the whole disinformation campaign that started from there really started from his hospital bed. So they weren't even leveraging really sophisticated disinformation methods back then. So the fear that we have now, as these things progresses and it gets increasingly easier to use these systems, is how we're gonna see that in motion in this particular election. So these systems are easy to use and very pervasive. One of the stories that I worked on, I tested several of these systems last year, and it's impressive how easily you can create a digital clone of yourself. And as I mentioned earlier, it's getting increasingly hard to monitor how these information spreads, and well, saying that a content was generated by AI, it's still generally not possible. Even the makers of these systems aren't able to tell once they are out there, or tell with a good accuracy that they are out there. So when we are talking about generating fake audios, for example, one of the main audio AI generated audio firms has a system that allows you to check them with 90-something% of accuracy, unless they are altered. So if you can just crop a little bit these audio, you can probably pass them on as being real. And there's also the opposite problem, which is what we saw in Argentina, where one of the picks for the pick for the economic minister for one of the candidates had his voice used for an alleged fake audio, and it has never been proved the legitimacy of that audio. But the thing is, he was able to dismiss that audio as being fake without further checking. So there's also fear that politicians will be able to just dismiss real information as being fake just by saying these are AI generated audios. This all plays into a reality that I also identified in my research, where we have well, news is generally episodic, right? So we are just reacting to whatever is happening. But what I noted is that there is a huge difficulty in moving on from what is going on, the facts, to a deeper discussion, and to sustain that discussion in particular across multiple months. and to really have people be AI literate through the news. So that's really hard to go on to do in the scenario of the news we have today, and especially because news companies are resource drained. The reporters are overworked and undertrained. So we have a particularly hard scenario to work with. And well, going on with the topic of this panel, some of you might have seen the discussions between Elon Musk and the Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes, which really speaks to the reach of these platforms. So Alexandre de Moraes had sent some decisions for Twitter to take down some accounts that were spreading misinformation across Brazil. Elon Musk decided to challenge that, and they started a judicial battle in Brazil, to the point that the Supreme Court in Brazil started investigating Elon Musk. Since then, Elon Musk has taken a few steps back and decided to comply with the Brazilian justice system. But the thing is, from this discussion, so we have this very powerful actor coming from abroad, acting in Brazil. So in a way that feels that he's away from the reach of the Brazilian justice system, and he can pretty much do as much of as he pleases, and the Brazilian justice system is quite limited in how they can respond to that. And going on from a little bit of how that can be seen in Brazilian news. So one of the things that I noted is that coverage in Brazil is very much product driven when we are talking about AI. So we will talk about the new features in Google's Bard, we will talk about the new GPT system, but we will not have much discussion about issues like racism, surveillance, job displacement, and colonialism. So racism is quite a big topic when talking about the technology history in Brazil, but it was pretty much not mentioned across the over 3,000 texts that I analyzed. It was mentioned only like 52 times. Whereas when we look at the top 20 entities that were mentioned in these texts, we will see that 15 of them are related to industry. So in the top 5, we will see ChatGPT, OpenAI, Google, and Microsoft. So these are pretty much dictating what we are talking about in Brazilian news. So we can see this reach that they have is present in the country through the news, but it's also not being picked up by people who are producing the news. And we can also see that influence from abroad when we see how much the New York Times appears in this data set, and how BBC dominates one of the topics that I identified through topic modeling. So the local scenario of covering this news it's quite challenging. So here I have some references to understand a little bit better the disinformation scenario in Brazil. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about it in the Q&A session, a little bit more about the computational methods that I use that I feel can provide very good insight, especially in this kind of scenario of having areas that are so understudied like Brazil. So for making this initial foray into how these topics are covered or how these topics are studied, I feel like they provide very valuable insight. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. It was all the panelists. We had a very interesting session, and I'm sure there were many questions from the attendees. I think there would be a lot of specific questions to all panelists, but I mean I can probably kickstart the question and answer session with a generalized question to all panelists, and I can actually invite you, because in the previous session we were actually kind of thinking in different ways about the role of the state, and to some extent actually this has come up a little bit in in Hai Chin's presentation where she spoke about, the largely the overall Chinese platforms and their perception generally as being as arm of the Chinese state. Plus, there are different takeaways from the different presentations, which are kind of Hai Chin has spoken about this, platformization of the misinformation, whereas, Ranjit, in your presentation, you've spoken about the different way forward when it comes to, addressing disinformation, like looking at literacy, responsibility, and also like, the way one can moderate and take an initiative responsibility in the whole process. And also, Rafael, you've largely spoken about the AI-generated disinformation. So probably I'll connect, all these different takeaways to like some of the things we were discussing in the previous panel also about the role of the state. And can I invite all the speakers to kind of comment on how do you actually see the state, intervening in this, whole process, maybe in the how, what does the state do? What is the role of the state in this platformization of misinformation? When it comes to Ranjit's work, you can probably speak about what the state can do when it comes to, addressing the issue of disinformation, while we keep in mind the kind of authoritarian tendencies in different states, across the world now. And also for, Rafael, I've also, invited to think about, like, when it comes to the AI-generated disinformation, we see a lot of this also, currently there are many elections, especially one in India, so where we see a lot of these different political parties and so on, that is in their campaign pages, a lot of AI-generated disinformation is there. So what is it that the, state does do, and what it can do in terms of taking a more progressive policy in addressing these issues? So can I invite you to start?
All right, I'll just start with, so I'll just, get on with it and so I can relax. I'm very hungry now, actually. Haven't had my dinner, almost 8 p.m. my time. All right. Comment on the role of the states. Depends on what nation state you're talking about, right? So if you talk about Australian government, it's pathetic. It doesn't have any control over any kind of social media platforms, that most Australians use. It tried to have the news bargaining code with the major platforms. However, recently news tells us that platforms like Facebook use algorithms to reduce the number of news media links on their platforms, therefore reducing their payment to the mainstream legacy media, mainly, Murdoch's media, of course, in Australia. So, there's Chinese way goes. There's always a strategy to deal with whatever the government policies are. Quite often those policies are old-fashioned, lag behind the technological development. And when it comes to states like the Chinese government, of course, it's probably one of the most powerful authoritarian states in the world that has a close relationship with the tech companies, and from the Baidu, Tencent, and Alibaba to all the new unicorns that are also challenging the existing positions of the big techs, all the big techs. So they have all these arsenals, basically the toolkits under their control, and therefore it's able to design, encourage, and fund numerous projects to you engage with and employ with AI technologies, not just to spread the information operation, influence operations abroad, but also to curb foreign interference via its own platforms. We know in China, all the Western platforms, American platforms have been blocked. Many of those internet links are also blocked. However, they are not able to block everything, right? It's especially those within Chinese diaspora who still use those platforms, and including those in the US, in Australia, in Hong Kong, and also from Taiwan as well. So they are using, from what I have read so far, the government has been funding lots of so-called AI research labs to identify ways to identify those misinformation. And in Australia, I have just participated in a big kind of Ministry of Defense kind of grant application on how to identify and stop the spread of misinformation on social media platforms. So one of the recommendations is to just make sure that all the contents are labeled, particularly those are produced by AI. However, it's very easy to say on paper, but it's very hard to do in reality. So I don't know. The role of the states are actually of course, when it comes to data localization, of course, the states can play a much bigger role. But when it comes to misinformation on social media platforms, I don't see, how much a bigger role that the states can go, especially in those countries where there's a deep mistrust of the nation states. Okay, that's all from me. Thanks.
So just building off of that point, I think one of the things that the Indian government has done in the last 1 year or so is to mandate some amount of data on ad targeting. It's a start. It's one of the ways in which I think about it is that depending upon the nature of the state, as Haiking pointed out, there are a lot of things that the state can basically ask media platform companies to do, and there are ways by which those requests are complied with versus ways in which you get to push back. But depending upon the nature of the state, it kind of changes how platform companies operate within that nation state as well. So there's a lot of power to be exercised here. It depends on what kind of power you're exercising and in what context. So I would basically parse it as one, this issue of data disclosure, which is kind of focused more on what are the kinds of ways in which we can actually get a little bit more sense of the kind of circulation of information that is happening on platform companies, and whether there is a way by which we can actually think through what ad targeting looks like and what kind of distribution channels are there to basically control spread of misinformation, especially, and this is kind of deeply relevant to the way in which COVID-19 misinformation landscape was kind of organized in different nation states, and how some of that information was kind of banned while others kind of continued to proliferate, and how that distinction worked out depended on the nature and the power of the state that the state could exercise on platforms. The second thing that I would say is the last point that Haiching was making, which is kind of on digital sovereignty, this issue of, where is your data stored? How do we actually start thinking about, whether data about your citizens is locally stored within the nation state or not? I think that to a certain extent has been a constant conversation for a while in many countries. And this imagination of sovereignty, or the idea that, data of my citizens is a national property, is an interesting phenomena, and how people are kind of trying to organize themselves in the context of this particular intervention is useful to think through, especially in the context of, how is data stored, where is it stored, and how do we actually know that, it is, how can we actually ensure that its circulation can be controlled? And the final point that I would make is that to some extent, this is most of the state actors are also on social media. So there is this really interesting combination of how state actors use social media in order to basically promote or articulate their own position on certain issues. There's a lot of positioning that happens, that state actors do in the context of how, they would like to basically present themselves on social media. And I think that is a really interesting dynamic to think through, especially in the way in which these representations then go on to shape not only what the policies look like for specific programs, but also to a certain extent, thinking through personal ambitions of state actors themselves. So I find that to be also a very interesting part of analyzing what's really going on when it comes to different local bureaucrats talking about their own programs on social media, and what that kind of looks like in the context of the way in which they represent themselves and the state. So it's a modality. State represents itself through these social media platforms as well. And that particular aspect of the dynamic is also deeply useful in thinking through what the state is doing in relation to social media. Raphael.
Okay, yes. So connecting a little bit to what my colleague said. So what I can talk a little bit more is about the Brazilian experience, understanding that it doesn't necessarily translate to other countries. So during the last election period, which was quite intense in terms of disinformation campaigns, the justice system acted as kind of a last line of defense, making platforms take down accounts and content that spread mis and disinformation. These were especially targeted at the electoral process itself, so casting doubt on the results of the election, casting doubt at the whole, at democracy as a whole. So that's something they're probably going to build up on for this election. This led to some discussions of the expansion of power of the justice system during this process and the limits up to which they could go. So sometimes it feels that they might have gone a little bit overboard and exerted some power that they shouldn't have, but at the same time, we can understand that they had a very important role in keeping the disinformation campaigns at bay. And one thing that is particularly useful is to tackle the funding that helps these disinformation campaigns to keep going, because we have troll armies working from there, people generating that content. They're often supported by business people in the Brazilian scenario. So once you start draining out this funding, these people have no way of continuing that kind of work. And as I mentioned through the presentation, the electoral court takes a large role in that during the Brazilian elections. One thing that really worked in the previous cycle was having their own disinformation and fact-checking services that really helped media companies in that scenario. Media companies themselves have been pairing up and creating big coalitions of generally competing news outlets. Since 2018, they have been working together to debunk some of the misinformation that they find in social media, because we understand that it doesn't really make sense to have multiple newsrooms working on the same piece of disinformation, because you only need to say, okay, this is false once, right? So, and all of them can publish them. And we have a very strict set of rules for this election cycle, which include no deep fakes being allowed whatsoever. Disinformation is also not allowed, which comes with some monitoring and having platforms take down disinformation, especially those that are targeted at the democracy process. No AI systems are allowed to communicate directly with voters. So if a candidate is thinking of making a chatbot to talk to people, it's a no-go. AI uses need to be made clear, so that's part of the rules that was passed on. And also they are forcing AI platforms that offer political ads to have a real-time reporting system. So just like that Facebook ad library that they rolled out for some countries a few years ago, they want that on steroids, which kind of led to some big tech companies pulling out of political ads. So Google is not going to allow political ads in Brazil. Twitter is not going to allow political ads in Brazil. Facebook still allows them, and they still are falling short on how their reporting system should go. So that's still looking a little bit murky. But yeah, so I think that's one example of how the state can act in regulating.
Wonderful. I mean, thanks for the response. So, I invite other panelists if you have any questions, maybe like, anyone in the room, like, Chirag, if you have a question,
Well, I mean, I just had one question, and I think Rafael answered most of it actually, which is to do with, how do we find ways to tackle disinformation? Now, here we are running a journalism school, and we're trying to equip our students to, the way we do it is to give them a sense of skepticism to begin with, and hope that that is going to do something towards helping them combat disinformation, but that cannot be an exhaustive education in itself. So what do you recommend are ways to teach students to handle AI generated disinformation?
Well, I think that's quite a big question, right? So, well, I'd say AI literacy is, well, fundamental in there. So that's something that I experienced a lot in the newsroom. Tech literacy as a whole is quite bad in newsroom. So I've been working with technology and cybersecurity training, and you can see those people who will go to a very secluded location to get a document drop off from a source that no one can know about, and then they will call them, and I'm like, okay, so all that went to the drain, right? So I think especially when we're talking about new generations of journalists that are to come, yeah, they need to have some training. They need to understand a little bit of the technical side. And one thing that I can't stress enough is mental health, because journalists are often also on the crosshairs of disinformation and campaigns that target them. And one thing that I saw a lot with my colleagues is how these attacks and the intensity of all this that is going on really drains people slowly to the point that you don't notice that, but after a while, you are starting to self-censor yourself. You're trying to think twice about publishing something. So really keep an open dialogue about this with your colleagues, with your editors, and really pay attention to that, because that's really heavy. And also, since I'm coming from that cybersecurity background as well, doing some basic checks on that, because often these attacks, these campaigns are associated with some other low-level cybersecurity attacks like doxing and well, other things like that. So if you do the basics well, and you have enough knowledge to do that, you can probably get by. So yeah, so literacy is recommendation 1, 2, and 3, and then also pay attention to your mental health and your digital hygiene.
Thank you.
Just
Yeah.
just to very quickly build on this, I think that there is value in inviting students to actually try and figure out what some of these applications can do. So for example, 11 Labs is a great example of an audio spoofing software, which allows you to basically take just a 1-minute clip of your voice and then basically create any message in your voice. So, and that is just an example of the ways in which some of these technologies, as they currently stand, are deeply shaping the landscape of what does it mean to actually share yourself online. And that, to a certain extent, is one way in which you can actually start to build that healthy skepticism around what you're looking in your landscape. So inviting people to actually unpack, a propaganda campaign, asking them to think through what does it mean to actually then try to train a system to identify that this is, poor information, incorrect, misinformation, whatever it might be. Just making a better sense of, what are you looking on your feed, and when do you identify that this feed actually represents something that you're interested in versus something that is being shown to you because you are a part of a broader landscape or a place that you live in, are deeply consequential questions. And to build that kind of literacy, it also requires us to basically continue having a conversation with students about these issues for a longer period of time. So, to some extent, I guess, the starting point of this is clearly the classes, but at the same time, try to see whether, a student can manage a Reddit, a group. That's a, interesting challenge. So it's partly also just trying to encourage students to think through what is their politics when it comes to some of these questions of whether this information should be on the platform, should not be on the platform, if they're moderating it themselves, is an open question as well.
Any response to your
Yeah, I have a couple of responses. One is about drawing on Regit's presentation on the three responses to disinformation. His response is, rather than the state-centered approach, he's taking a community or group citizen-centered approach to disinformation, and that actually speaks well to what I would also recommend, talking about journalism education, how students should be taught about doing fact checking and identifying misinformation. And that also reminds me of the kind of institution that we work with, thinking about the last panel, Matt's presentation on how pro-Palestinians are framed differently on Facebook than those pro-Israelis, and how platforms play the role in setting the agenda, including kind of deliberate mistranslation, right? And how do we teach students to identify facts from the sea of facts? Whose facts? What you think is misinformation may be facts to me. What you think is missing, what you think is information, maybe disinformation to me, because I disagree with you. So, that in that kind of seed of information and the disinformation, I think it's not just a challenge for students, it's a challenge for all of us to trust where the source is from, to see where the source is from. Again, back to the older Lasswell's model of communication. Who says what, through which channel, with what technology, to achieve what effect? And it's still relevant today, almost more than half a century on, right? So I think it's quite often what's new here, we think it's not quite new when you have lived long enough, and you think, history has repeated itself, except with new forms of technologies. Yeah, I don't know. I think my key point is to think outside the box, outside the constraints of our institution. Thanks.
Wonderful. Do we have any other questions from the panelists, from Kelly or Shadi?
None from me. I just wanted to say thank you so much. I mean, I really found this to be such a fascinating set of talks. And I think the way that they also all adhered together was really interesting as well. And so I'm definitely excited to go away and dive into a lot of the readings and ideas that you brought up as well. So yeah, thank you again.
Yeah, Sam, I think we got introduced to a great range of cases, right from hygiene to the Ranjit's and Rafael's presentations. There's a lot for the specific cases for us to go back and look at. So yeah, I mean, it was a really interesting conversation with many things for us to think about in the coming days. So if there are no other questions, we should actually wrap up this session. Thank you very much to all the panelists for being here. And yeah, I mean, okay, and we again reconvene tomorrow.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.